Theon Greyjoy stood upon the ramparts of Winterfell with the wind biting at his cheeks, as if the very cold itself condemned every breath he took. Snow swirled across the courtyard, blanketing the old stones in a restless shroud of white. The sky loomed low and dark, mirroring the dread in his stomach. Beneath his gloved fingers, the ancient battlements seemed to resonate with the ghosts of 1,000 battles, whispering of loyalties tested and courage measured on this very ground. Through the drifting white haze, torches shimmered along the walls, flickering like distant starfall. Theon closed his eyes for the briefest of moments, remembering the last time he'd been here, when guilt and failure weighed upon him heavier than any chain. Now, with the long night upon them, only the living's resolve stood in defiance of the endless dark. Theon shuddered, aware that in the tumult of the coming battle, absolution and sacrifice often shared the same breath. From the eastern tower, the horn sounded, a forlorn note echoing across the courtyard. Men and women scrambled to their positions, clad in patched armor and furs, their breaths pluming in ragged puffs. For Theon, this was not the time to dwell on his personal redemption. He had come to fight, to protect Winterfell, and to stand with the Starks in their most desperate hour. The castle he once betrayed was now the bulwark between humanity and the endless hordes of undead. He stood there, the memory of the Iron Islands an ache in his chest, a brine-soaked history that seemed a world away. He breathed in the bitter tang of the northern air, pushing aside that old restlessness. He was here and he would fight, no matter the cost. The great hall behind him rattled with the commotion of preparations. In the distance, the clang of steel on steel punctuated frantic voices. Winterfell was not just any castle. It was the living heart of the North, pulsing with the stubborn will of House Stark. Theon had once tried to crush that will, to claim Winterfell for his own name. Now, the same walls that had seen him undone would serve as his shield. If the gods had any notion of humor, this must have been the punchline. A once pretender, now the castle's defender. Still, Theon felt no laughter stir in him, only a grim resolve that churned with every beat of his heart. He could sense eyes on him, some curious, others hostile. There were men of the North who remembered his treachery, who bore the scars he had inflicted or the losses he had caused. Some would never forgive. But in these dire times, hatred and grudges lay half-buried in the snow. Survival demanded unity. Even so, Theon caught the occasional glare. He would meet those cold stares, heart-pounding, and then look away. If all went well, if indeed any of them lived to see the dawn, perhaps he would prove himself not only as a Greyjoy but as a true ally, a brother-in-arms worthy of the trust that had once been so freely given to him. He walked along the battlements, checking on the archers and the lines of pitch-filled trenches that would be ignited when the undead came. His breath came faster with each step, the gravity of what they faced pressing on him. Bran Stark was in the Godswood under watch. Jon Snow would be on the front lines, no doubt, sword in hand, unwavering in his pursuit of the realm's safety. Daenerys Targaryen had her Unsullied and Dothraki ready, while her dragons roared somewhere above, occasionally blotting out the moon with their colossal silhouettes. The plan was set, but everyone knew how quickly battle plans could crumble when fear and chaos took the field. Theon prayed in silence to any god that would listen. Let them hold this line. Let them buy enough time for the living to endure. Davos Seaworth spotted him from below, lifting a hand in greeting. Theon returned the gesture stiffly, uncertain if there was any warmth behind it. Ser Davos was a man of unwavering loyalty, shaped by loss and sacrifice. He, too, had cause to resent Theon. Yet the Onion Knight had always been a man of reason. If he could see redemption in Theon's eyes, perhaps that was a start. Theon offered the older man a nod, then continued along the wall until he reached the northern side, where the gates stood shut tight. The towering doors, banded with iron, felt like the last threshold between Winterfell and the end of all things. This was where the brunt of the attack was expected. This was where Theon intended to stand. He arrived at a small platform near the gatehouse, rummaging through a crate of arrows. His fingers trembled as he counted them, though not from the cold alone. Each arrow represented a chance, slim but present, to hold back the endless wave of whites and White Walkers. He took stock of the spears, the swords, anything that might be used once the arrows ran out. At his side, a young soldier cleared his throat. Theon glanced up to see one of the Winterfell garrison, no older than 18, watching him with wide eyes. He didn't know the boy's name, their gazes locked. Whatever resentment might have lain between them, the fear of death overshadowed it. With a curt nod, Theon moved on, making his silent vow. I will protect you. I will protect the North. If I die in the process, so be it. Somewhere behind him, the castle's ravens took flight in a flurry of feathers, carrying last-minute messages, maybe pleas or warnings. There was no time for second thoughts. Each soldier along the battlements settled into their station with weapons gripped tight. Their glances drifted out into the darkness, searching for the first sign of an approaching nightmare. Rumors had told of the Night King's legions, a quiet onslaught that devoured entire kingdoms in the hush of endless winter. No shrieks, no war cries, only the cold hush of the dead, unstoppable and pitiless. Theon forced himself to remain steady, reciting a silent litany of purpose in his mind. This was not about glory or even redemption alone. This was about fighting the darkness until his last breath, about ensuring that dawn might come again. Hours might have passed, or mere minutes, when the first flicker of movement appeared on the horizon. Theon squinted into the night, half wondering if the darkness played tricks on his vision. But there it was, a slow, dreadful crawl of motion. Then, further off, silhouettes began to manifest against the snow. The watchers on the walls quieted. Torches flickered. The air seemed to freeze in their lungs as more figures emerged from the gloom. Scores, hundreds, thousands of the dead. The army of the Night King. A gust of wind howled across the field, carrying with it the faint stench of decay. Banners fluttered around Winterfell's ramparts, but no one spoke. The line of whites became clearer by the heartbeat, gaunt bodies in tattered rags, some clad in old armor from battles long lost, others with bits of flesh hanging loosely. Their eyes glowed with a cold blue, an otherworldly spark that chilled Theon's soul. This was the enemy they had dreaded, the enemy they had prepared for. Bowstrings tightened. Theon felt his own heart thunder as he nocked an arrow, the goose feather fletching brushing his cheek. He peered down the arrow's length. The gate stood firm beneath him, but how long could it truly stand against such a tide? All at once, the drums of war beat inside Theon's chest. He let his arrow fly. Along the wall, dozens, hundreds of archers loosed their arrows. The night became alive with the hiss of shafts slicing the air. Many struck their marks, felling whites in the front ranks, but the dead only pressed onward, climbing over their fallen as though they were lumps of snow. A crash of distant thunder, or perhaps a roar from one of Daenerys's dragons, reverberated across the plain. It was beginning. Theon's teeth clenched as he reached for another arrow and heard the urgent screams of the living echo across the battlements. Fear sank its claws into him, but so did purpose. He would not break. A second volley sprang from Winterfell's walls. Torches along the ramparts illuminated the swirling snow, creating halos of light that guttered out into the infinite black. The whites drew closer, their soulless stares locked on the living above. Some soldiers on the walls murmured desperate prayers to the old gods and the new, to the Seven, to the drowned god. Any deity that might grant them mercy in this final stand. Theon closed his eyes for a heartbeat, letting the crisp tension of the bow steady him. He reminded himself that once he had been a crack shot with a bow, once he had reigned victorious in smaller battles. Yet none of that measured up to this night. Everything he had ever done led him to this moment. With a piercing cry, the first wave of whites threw themselves against the spiked wooden palisades set up in front of the gate. Theon watched as the undead impaled themselves on sharpened stakes without hesitation, mindless puppets of the Night King's will. More poured in behind them, trampling the impaled, bridging the palisade with their own corpses. Across the battlefield, men with flasks of pitch flung them onto the approaching throng, igniting the front ranks. Flames roared up, and screams of the newly burning whites cut through the night. Yet the undead did not stop. They never did. Theon signaled to the men beside him on the wall. They lifted massive clay pots filled with dragon glass-tipped arrows and flaming oil. In a synchronized movement, these pots tumbled from the ramparts, shattering amid the press of the undead. Fire leapt high, devouring dozens. Still more pressed from behind. The first line of whites reached the gates, skeletal hands clawing at the reinforced wood. The pounding was relentless. Steel flared as defenders at the foot of the walls stabbed down with spears. Theon shot arrow after arrow, sweat mingling with the snow that clung to his hair and face. Across the courtyard, Theon could hear the clangor of other vantage points unleashing their defenses. The strategy was simple. Hold them off for as long as possible, use the castle's layered defenses to thin their numbers, and pray that Daenerys's dragons, or some miracle, could wipe out enough of the threat before they were overwhelmed. In the distance, he glimpsed a swirl of fiery breath as Drogon or Rhaegal unleashed dragonflame upon a horde of undead, lighting the night sky in brilliant orange. A cheer arose from the defenders for just a moment, but it was swallowed by the continued onslaught of the dead. Suddenly, from beyond the lines of whites, a chill wind gusted. The flames sputtered, as if an icy breath consumed them. Theon felt a clawing dread seep into his bones. The White Walkers were out there. Their presence made the temperature plummet, and the swirling snow thickened, turning into a near blizzard. Arrows slowed in their flights, their arcs disrupted by the wind. Theon tasted the tang of fear in the back of his throat. He had heard tales of those creatures since childhood, but none of the stories did justice to the terror that now stalked the battlefield. If the Night King himself was here, Winterfell's final battle had truly begun. The barrier of the gates groaned. Theon hurried down from the ramparts to check the bracing beams. The men stationed at the gate were young, or old, or battered. Some had faces twisted in terror, others wore a grim acceptance. Theon helped them reinforce the gate with extra beams, lashing ropes to hold them in place. Every slam from the whites outside sent splinters flying, each one a reminder that their time was measured in heartbeats. One soldier whimpered that the gate wouldn't hold, that they were all doomed. Theon placed a firm hand on the man's shoulder, forcing calm into his voice. "Hold, as long as we can. Fight." Lightning crackled across the sky, illuminating the scene for one harrowing moment. Theon caught the outline of a figure, tall and gaunt, gliding through the masses of the dead, one of the White Walkers. The creature held a spear of ice, its expression unreadable but chilling in its absolute confidence. Despite the swirling chaos, Theon felt that inhuman gaze for an instant, as if the White Walker had marked him. He forced his breath to steady, returning to the ramparts as quickly as he could. The safety of the gate was precarious at best. He had to keep firing, keep the horde from concentrating their force in one spot. As he reached the top of the wall again, Theon found the archers had dropped their bows and were now taking up close-range weapons. A portion of the undead had begun to climb, using the frozen mortar lines of the castle as handholds. Long, dead fingers grasped at the stone, scraping for purchase. The defenders hacked at them with swords, axes, anything that could break the lethal ascent. Theon peered over the edge. Everywhere below were the living dead. He shot an arrow directly into the skull of a white clinging to the wall. Fell back into the mass, but another took its place. The night was a frenzy of violence and desperation. Roars from the courtyard erupted as the first wave that breached the wall sprang inside. They had scaled a portion of the battlement near the old smithy, where the watch had been thin. Men shouted, steel clashed, and the living scrambled to contain the incursion. Theon cursed under his breath. Winterfell was large, and the defenders were spread out. Theon signaled to a handful of men to follow him, and they descended the stairs, racing toward the courtyard. A swirl of snow and ash stung their faces, but Theon pressed on, pushing past those who fled from the whites now pouring onto the rampart. The courtyard was a vision of slaughter. Torches cast flickering illumination on a group of whites tearing into the ranks of the living. Theon and his companions fell upon them from behind, driving steel into icy flesh. His sword found purchase between two vertebrae of a wight, snapping the skeleton in two. Another turned, jaws opening in a voiceless hiss. Theon drove a dagger of dragonglass into the creature's ribs, and it collapsed into a disintegrating heap. Around him, the defenders rallied for a moment, emboldened by the newcomers. Together they pushed the undead back toward the nearest wall, buying precious seconds to regroup. Theon's muscles burned, and the swirl of snow and smoke made it hard to breathe, but the fear gave him speed, a desperate reflex to survive. In the far corner of the courtyard, Gendry swung a warhammer with enough force to splinter half a dozen wights at once. Nearby, Arya Stark danced through the fray like a wisp of smoke, her slender sword darting with lethal precision. Theon caught a glimpse of her face, resolute and grim, as she brought down a wight with a swift slash across its neck. They locked eyes for an instant, and in that flicker of recognition, Theon felt her acknowledgement that he, too, was fighting for Winterfell, that he, too, was done running from who he had once been. A roar echoed overhead, and a gust of heat and light scorched the eastern rampart. Theon looked up to see the dark silhouette of a dragon. Either Drogon or Rhaegal unleashed a torrent of flame, incinerating a swath of the undead who had nearly surmounted the wall. For an instant, hope surged in him. Daenerys was still in the skies, still fighting. Perhaps they could hold out a bit longer. The dead who had infiltrated the courtyard were temporarily pushed back, retreating in stumbling steps as the defenders mounted a fierce retaliation. Yet that momentary reprieve vanished as quickly as it came. The wind picked up, swirling snow in a fierce blizzard that dimmed the flames, leaving everything in a haze of gray. A new cry rose from the walls, someone shouting the Night King's name. Theon felt the blood drain from his face. Their enemy's general had arrived. Perhaps even the Night King himself was among them, for only his power could so suddenly quell a dragon's fire from above. Anxiety lanced through Theon. If that creature was here, it meant that the darkest moment of the battle was upon them. They had to survive until dawn. But in the swirling snows, dawn felt like a myth. Once more, the gate boomed with a thunderous impact, the moan of wood giving way to metal's shriek. Theon dashed back toward it, weaving through the carnage. As he neared the gatehouse, a wave of wights crashed through the splintered beams. The defenders fought valiantly, but the dead surged in relentless numbers. Bodies collided in the narrow passageway as men screamed and steel shattered. Within moments, the undead spread out into the courtyard, fanning in a wave of black and white. Theon's heart hammered. If the gate was lost, the castle was lost. With Winterfell breached, it was only a matter of time before the living were cornered. He raised his sword, rallying a handful of troops nearby. Their eyes were wild, but they fell in behind him. Together they formed a makeshift shield wall, trying to contain the surge. Theon stabbed his blade into the face of a wight that lunged at him with claw-like nails. He felt the grinding of bone against steel, and the creature toppled. Another replaced it, swinging the rusted remains of a longsword. Theon met the blow, parrying it, but the force of the attack jarred his already numb fingers. He thrust forward, adrenaline guiding his every movement. They fought like cornered wolves, pushing the line of wights back step by step. Each movement was an agony of exertion, each breath a raw gust in the freezing air. Theon heard men screaming on either side, felt the hot spray of blood across his cheek, but he did not falter. He refused to break this time. He had once been Theon of Pike, the arrogant ward-turned-betrayer. Now he was something else entirely. A man finding his place at the edge of the world, forging honor in the crucible of the long night. Between the swirl of snow and the chaos of battle, Theon glimpsed a figure standing atop the broken gate. It was tall, with eyes like chips of ice set in a face carved from pale stone. A crown of horns wreathed its skull. Theon's heart pounded at the sight of the Night King himself, gazing over the carnage with an eerie stillness. There was no triumph or fury there, only cold inevitability, as if the Night King knew Winterfell was but a stepping stone toward the endless dark. Around him, the dead continued their slaughter. But for Theon, the world narrowed to that figure. He knew, somehow in the pit of his soul, that this was the crux of the battle. Either the Night King would fall or all would be lost. Sweat and snow dripped from Theon's brow as he shouted, "To the gates!" He broke from the line of defenders, chasing that haunting silhouette. A few of his men followed, though none seemed eager to face the Night King head-on. They clambered over debris, bodies of the dead and dying, forging a desperate path. Theon's lungs burned, and he stumbled on a piece of broken wood, nearly losing his footing. But a hand caught his elbow, one of the soldiers who had not deserted him. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment, a bond of survival and mutual terror. The Night King watched them approach with an almost lazy regard, as if the act of Theon's defiance amused him. A faint curl at the corner of his lips, if it could be called that, suggested a mockery of mortal resolve. Around him, the swirling snow thickened, obscuring the stars above. Theon tightened his grip on his sword, ignoring how his arm trembled from exhaustion. Every breath rattled in his chest. "This is it," he thought. "This is where I find out if the gods have forgiven me, or if my fate is to die broken and forgotten." From behind the Night King strode 2 White Walkers, each armed with a weapon forged of razor-sharp ice. Their eyes glowed with that same frosty malevolence. They advanced on Theon's group, silent but deadly. Theon's men hesitated. One took a step back. Theon swallowed hard. "Stand and fight!" he roared, though it felt like shouting at the wind. Without waiting for them, he sprinted forward, sword raised. The White Walkers moved to intercept him, their steps fluid and inhumanly graceful. At the last moment, Theon ducked beneath a sweeping slash of an ice blade, feeling the chill pass mere inches above his head. He retaliated, swinging his sword upward, aiming for the Walker's torso. Metal rang against ice. Theon's sword shattered on impact, the shards glinting as they fell into the blood-stained snow. The Walker sneered, lifting its blade for a killing blow. Panic shot through Theon. He dropped the useless hilt and fumbled for his dragonglass dagger. A fraction of a heartbeat before the ice blade could cleave him, Theon sidestepped and drove the dagger into the Walker's side. A shriek pierced the air, the creature's inhuman wail echoing with primal fury. Cracks of light spread from the wound, and in an instant, it exploded into shards of icy dust. Theon staggered back, breathing hard. The second Walker slashed at him with lightning speed. Theon parried with the dragonglass dagger, but the impact knocked him off balance. He stumbled, falling to one knee, struggling to keep the blade in his grip. The Walker loomed over him, a statue of frozen malevolence, prepared to end his life. Yet from behind, one of Theon's men rammed a spear of dragonglass into the Walker's spine, the monstrous being shattered, disintegrating into nothing. Theon exhaled, relief mingled with the cold certainty that the true threat still stood, watching them with those alien blue eyes. The Night King did not move, nor did he draw a weapon. He simply stood at the threshold of Winterfell's splintered gate, the swirling snow forming a halo of darkness around him. Theon panted, exhausted, but forced himself to rise. Each muscle screamed in protest. He retrieved his dagger and clenched it so tightly his knuckles whitened. Looking to his side, he saw that only 2 of the men who had followed him remained alive. They quivered, fear etched into every line of their faces, but they did not flee. Theon felt a flicker of gratefulness. Together they advanced. Without warning, the Night King raised one hand. A crackling sound reverberated through the courtyard. The bodies of the freshly slain began to twitch, their limbs spasming, heads lolling. Panic erupted among the living as the dead rose once more, turning on those they had just fought beside. Theon watched in horror as men who had breathed moments ago were now mindless puppets under the Night King's thrall. The reanimated corpses lurched, gnashing their teeth, attacking anyone who still drew breath. The castle courtyard dissolved into madness once again. Theon's 2 companions found themselves beset by these newly risen wights. Theon tried to intervene, but a savage group of undead blocked his path. He slashed with his dagger, carving through frozen sinew, but more wights crowded in. Over and over, Theon stabbed, tears freezing on his lashes. The men who had stood beside him, who had just saved his life, vanished beneath the swarm of clawing hands. Theon howled, half in rage, half in anguish, as he fought to reach them. But there was no path. He stumbled backward, alone once again. The Night King watched him, unblinking. A silent challenge emanated from that icy gaze. Theon's pulse pounded in his ears as the swirling snow parted just enough for him to see the dark reflection of his own life in that face. The betrayals, the weaknesses, the pain. He realized, with a sudden clarity, that the Night King felt nothing, cared for nothing. And that was where Theon found his advantage. He, in his fragile human form, cared deeply. He cared for the Starks, for the men and women who fought and died around him. He cared for the promise of a dawn beyond the horrors of this night. And perhaps, in that compassion, there was a power stronger than the chill of the grave. He tightened his grip on the dragonglass dagger and forced himself to move forward. The whites loomed around him, but he skirted their grasp, fueled by a desperate determination. He was done running. He was done allowing his mistakes to define him. If it cost him his life to stop this creature, he would pay that price. Each step felt like an eternity, time slowing as the wind roared in his ears. The Night King remained motionless, as though waiting, as though certain that Theon was no threat. A few yards away, Theon's foot slipped on a patch of ice, nearly sending him sprawling. He recovered at the last instant, his dagger scraping against the stone. Now within striking distance, he roared and lunged. He aimed to bury the dragonglass in the Night King's heart. But the creature moved with a speed beyond mortal comprehension. In a blink, Theon's wrist was caught in an iron grip, the Night King's cold hand crushing bone. Pain flared white-hot in Theon's arm. He cried out, forced to his knees. The knife tumbled from his numb fingers, landing in the snow with a dull thud. Theon's vision blurred with agony, but he glared up at the Night King, lips curled in defiance. The creature's other hand rose, forming an icicle spear seemingly out of the swirling sleet. Theon braced himself for death, for the end that he believed he deserved as much as he feared. He heard the howling wind and the clamor of the living behind him. Somewhere in the distance, a dragon roared. In that final moment, Theon closed his eyes, recalling the faces of those he had wronged. Robb Stark, whom he had loved like a brother. Bran Stark, whose home he had seized. Sansa, whom he had failed again and again. Yara, who remained the only family that might still have him. "Forgive me," he pleaded, even if no one answered. There was a thunderous crash. Theon opened his eyes just in time to see a shape streaking through the storm. A direwolf-like blur. Ghost? No, it was a large mound of gray fur, snarling savagely as it collided with the Night King. The blow was enough to break the creature's grip on Theon's wrist. Theon slumped forward, cradling his broken arm, and realized that it was Nymeria, Arya Stark's long-lost wolf, returned from the wild with her pack. She had leapt into the fray, risking everything in a furious assault on the Night King. The monstrous specter staggered back, momentarily stunned. The whites turned their attention to Nymeria, claws and blades lashing out. But the dire wolf was not alone. Other wolves charged from the darkness, tearing into the undead. The courtyard erupted in snarls and blood. Seizing the chance, Theon crawled through the snow, searching frantically for his fallen dagger. Shouts erupted all around. Whites shrieked as dire wolves ripped them apart, though the creatures of the dead quickly regrouped, hammering back with relentless strikes. Still, that brief distraction had given Theon his moment. His hand finally closed around the hilt of the dragonglass dagger. Gritting his teeth against the pain, he rose to his feet, leaning forward to keep from toppling. The Night King dispatched a snarling wolf with a twist of its icy spear. Nymeria yelped as she was flung back by an impossibly strong blow. All at once, the swirling snow parted, and the Night King loomed again, stepping closer. Their eyes met, and Theon felt a chill deeper than any winter. Yet he stood firm, the dagger held in his left hand, his broken right arm dangling uselessly. He did not run. He did not kneel. Summoning every last ounce of will, Theon charged. The Night King thrust the spear, the tip shimmering with lethal intent. Theon twisted his body, letting the spear slice across his ribs instead of impaling him. The searing pain almost dropped him to his knees, but he fought on. With a savage cry, he rammed the dragonglass dagger upward, aiming directly for the place where the Night King's heart should be. For a split second, he felt resistance, an icy barrier that made his soul feel as though it might shatter. Then, with a sound like glass fracturing, the dagger sank in. Silence. The courtyard froze in that moment, every living fighter turning as the Night King's eyes widened. A web of cracks radiated from the wound, spreading like lightning across the creature's chest. Theon remained there, arm trembling, dagger embedded deep in the monster's flesh. He could scarcely believe it, fear and hope warring in his heart. The Night King's face contorted in fury or perhaps shock, and then he shattered. 1,000 icy fragments exploded outward. A rush of air knocked Theon off his feet, sending him sprawling into the snow. Time felt suspended in the aftermath. Theon's ears rang. Gradually, he realized the wights around them were collapsing, one after another, as though marionettes with severed strings. The dreadful glow in their eyes faded, leaving nothing but corpses lying still. The watchers on the walls, battered and exhausted, were silent, unsure if this was truly the end or just another trick. But the wights did not rise again. Instead, across the castle, the dead sagged to the ground, unmoving. He had done it. By the old gods, by the seven, by the drowned god, Theon had killed the Night King. A ragged cheer erupted, uncertain at first, then spreading as the living realized the tide had turned irrevocably. Snow still fell, and the wind still howled, but the unstoppable legion of the dead was no more. Theon lay on his back, pain radiating from his broken arm and bleeding side. His vision swam, overwhelmed by exhaustion. He turned his head, glimpsing the first glimmer of gray dawn creeping over the eastern horizon. Somehow, the night had nearly passed. He didn't realize how many had gathered around him until he felt hands lifting him gently, supporting his battered body. Through the haze, he saw faces, familiar, terrified, hopeful. Davos was there, barking orders for the maester to see to Theon's wounds. Arya Stark knelt beside him, her expression fierce and bright with unshed tears. "Stay with us," she said firmly, pressing a cloth to his bloody side. Somewhere behind them, wolves prowled among the dead, their eyes watchful, uncertain as to whether they, too, might vanish with the undone magic. But Nymeria did not fade. She stood guard, muzzle stained with blood, protective until the last. Theon let his eyelids droop, letting unconsciousness wash over him with the silent prayer that he had done enough, that Winterfell would stand and the living would see the sun rise once more. He awoke in the great hall. The high rafters looked somehow different with the sunlight streaming through the battered windows. Voices drifted around him. Pain lanced through his side, and he groaned softly. A gentle hand came to rest on his forehead. He blinked, focusing on a solemn, round-faced maester who was examining his bandages. "He's awake," the maester murmured. A swirl of movement followed, but Theon could scarcely keep his eyes open. He slipped back into darkness, lulled by the realization that he was safe, and the living had won the night. The next time he woke, the hall was quiet, save for a few hushed voices. Sunlight had shifted in the windows, suggesting midday. Theon tried to sit up, but a searing pain in his ribs and arm made him gasp. A voice to his left told him to lie still. He turned to see Sansa Stark, her red hair glowing in the light, face drawn with fatigue and relief. "Theon," she whispered, eyes glistening. He noticed tears, which she did not bother to hide. "You saved us." He swallowed, struggling to find words. The memory of the Night King's cold grip was vivid in his mind. His broken arm was bound in a splint, and his torso swathed in bandages. He managed a raspy whisper. "Is it over?" She nodded, pressing her lips together. "It is. They all fell when you..." when you struck him. Around them, men and women rested on pallets, some groaning with wounds, some so silent they might have passed. The hall was a makeshift infirmary, but there was a hush of victory mingled with the sorrow of the lost. Theon's eyes flicked back to Sansa. He tried to speak again, but his voice failed him. She seemed to understand, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "We owe you our lives, Theon Greyjoy." He felt a strange prickling at those words. For so long, he had believed himself damned. Now, hearing gratitude in Sansa's voice unraveled some ancient knot in his chest. He tried to shake his head, to deny that he deserved such praise. But the look on her face silenced his doubts. "Thank you," he finally managed to croak. And in those two words, he poured a lifetime of regret and shame and gratitude. Tears blurred his vision, and he let them fall. Over the following days, Winterfell recovered, or tried to. Burial pyres were lit for the fallen, their smoke staining the sky above the snow-laden ramparts. The living walked in a daze, half in mourning, half in relief that the nightmare was ended. Theon found himself confined to the makeshift infirmary for most of that time, drifting between fevered dreams and pained reality. In his fractured sleep, he would see the Night King's eyes and feel that cold grip on his wrist once again, only to wake shivering in the candlelit hall. Yet in those waking moments, Sansa was often there, or Arya or Bran, each in their own way offering him silent company, a comfort he had never expected nor deserved. On the evening of the third day, Theon sat up with great effort, wincing as he tested the limits of his damaged ribs. Bran Stark was wheeled into the hall by a Northman. Theon watched the boy, no, the young man, his eyes distant yet piercing all the same. Theon recalled how he had tried to kill Bran once to keep hold of Winterfell. The shame of that memory constricted his chest. But Bran offered no reproach. Instead, he regarded Theon with a calm that seemed to span centuries. "You saved me," Bran said, voice soft. Theon frowned, unsure how to respond. The memory of standing outside the gods would, vow in his heart, replayed in his mind. He had promised to protect Bran, though in the chaos of the final battle, he had ended up elsewhere. He struggled to find the words. "I meant to protect you. I'm sorry I wasn't there." But Bran shook his head. "You fulfilled your purpose. You did what needed to be done." At that, Theon felt a flicker of amazement. Some part of him had believed that his grand intentions, his heartfelt promises, would crumble under the weight of reality. Yet here was Bran, the boy who was once crippled by Theon's misguided conquest, telling him he had done enough. A wave of emotion threatened to overwhelm him again. He turned away, swallowing the knot in his throat. Word of Theon's deeds spread quickly among those who had survived. Tales circulated of how he had stood against the Night King, how he'd thrust a dagger of dragonglass into the heart of the darkness itself. Some whispered it was the old gods who guided his hand, a final chance for redemption. Others claimed the spirit of Ned Stark had intervened, granting Theon the courage to protect the family he had once wronged. Whatever the truth, Theon found himself the reluctant center of gratitude. Ravens carried messages across the realm, proclaiming the downfall of the Night King at the hands of Theon Greyjoy. For the first time in his life, Theon did not shrink under praise, though it made him uneasy. He accepted it with quiet humility, his eyes averted, still grappling with the enormity of what had transpired. Gradually, he healed. Each day, he forced himself to walk a bit further through the corridors of Winterfell. He'd pause to offer a comforting word to grieving families, or to help reposition a friend's body on a pyre. Though his steps were stiff, his broken arm throbbed relentlessly, and his side burned where the Night King's spear had grazed him. He refused to remain idle. This was a penance of sorts, an act of shared mourning and solace. Sometimes he would stand near the old courtyard archery butts, remembering that carefree boy he once was, loosing arrows alongside Robb Stark, believing the world was a place of endless summers. How distant that life seemed now. He encountered Jon Snow one late afternoon. Jon was overseeing the distribution of supplies, his face etched with weariness. They locked eyes across a pile of firewood. Jon set down his burden and approached. For a moment, they were both silent, the tension of old wounds lingering between them. Then Jon spoke, voice gruff but sincere. "Thank you, Theon, for what you did for all of us." Theon inclined his head, unsure what else to do. "Jon, I'm sorry for everything I've done. You know what I speak of. I can't change that, but—" Jon lifted a hand, halting him. "We can't change the past, but we can choose what we do next. You saved the world from the dead." His lips twitched in a faint smile, sadness flickering in his eyes. "That's no small thing." They parted then, each carrying the scars of old feuds but finding something that resembled forgiveness. For Theon, it was a moment of quiet absolution. It did not erase his regrets, but it allowed him to carry them without the same crushing weight. He was no longer just a man defined by his failures. He was a survivor, a protector, a slayer of the Night King. He still felt unworthy of those titles, but they were his to bear nonetheless. As the days rolled into weeks, the winter storms began to lessen, revealing a pale sun in the sky more frequently. Far from gone, the cold lingered, but the blizzards that had once seemed endless gradually subsided. Life stirred within Winterfell's walls, albeit changed forever by the cataclysm they had endured. Theon took to walking the ramparts again, gazing out at the snow-covered fields where the dead once swarmed. Piles of bones and rubble were being cleared away, the land haunted by silhouettes of shattered weapons and half-burnt pyres. Occasionally, Theon closed his eyes, remembering that chaotic struggle, the swirl of snow and flame. He wondered if he would ever truly sleep peacefully. One late morning, he ventured into the Godswood. The great weirwood tree stood, branches laden with snow, its carved face weeping red sap. Here, the air seemed still, as though the old gods themselves held court in silent vigil. Theon approached with tentative steps. He knelt before the ancient trunk, feeling the weight of the quiet pressing upon him. Slowly, he bowed his head, letting the hush of the place settle around him. In the distance, water dripped in an unseen corner, and the faint rustle of wind in the branches was the only sound. Words did not come easily. Theon pressed his hand against the cold bark, recalling the faces of those he had loved and lost. He thought of Eddard Stark, the man who had raised him like a son. He remembered Yara, who believed in him even after he failed her. And then he remembered the faces of those who had died during his betrayal of Winterfell. Farmers' sons, loyal guards, friends who had once taught him how to swing a sword. Slowly, haltingly, he spoke in a low voice. "I don't know if there's any forgiveness for me, but if there is, thank you." He closed his eyes, tears hot against the cold. "Thank you for giving me the chance to do one thing right." He stayed there for a long time, until the ache in his wounded side grew too strong to ignore. As he rose to leave, he spotted Bran sitting nearby in his wheeled chair, half hidden by the trees. Had he been there the whole time? Theon felt a rush of embarrassment, as if his private words had been spied upon. But Bran's expression was calm, unintrusive. "You are part of this place, Theon," he said quietly. "In your own way, in ways you might not understand yet." Theon managed a small nod. He realized that, for the first time in his life, he felt a sense of belonging in Winterfell. It was not the grasping desire to prove himself superior that had once consumed him, nor the shame that had driven him away. It was a quiet, resolute acceptance that here, among the Starks, he had found more than just a castle. He had found a family he had once stolen from, and now he had returned a debt that could never be fully measured in words. In that acceptance, Theon felt an unexpected serenity. A fortnight later, in the Great Hall, there was a gathering to honor the fallen and to recognize the heroes who had defended Winterfell. Lords and ladies from across the north and a few from beyond had come, bearing witness to the destruction and the hope that had emerged from its ashes. Jon Snow, Sansa Stark, and Arya Stark stood at the head of the hall. Daenerys Targaryen, regal in her bearing despite the weariness etched into her features, was at Jon's side. Even she had offered Theon a small nod of respect at some point, the Khaleesi's fierce eyes acknowledging the man who had saved her forces from the unstoppable. The hall was adorned with solemn decorations. Evergreen boughs and white flowers, tokens of life amidst the bleak winter. Theon entered quietly, leaning on a carved walking stick to compensate for his healing injuries. He wore plain clothes of northern cut, not the finery of a lord, nor the salt-stained garb of the Iron Islands. He found a seat near the rear, wishing for anonymity. He was no lord or champion to stand among the dais. Yet the eyes of the crowd soon turned to him. A hush spread. Sansa's voice rang out, "Theon Greyjoy." He hesitated, a flush creeping up his neck. All the seats of honor were watching him. Slowly, he stood and made his way forward, each step measured to hide the pain. As he reached the front, he felt the weight of hundreds of gazes. It reminded him of standing in the feasting hall at Pike as a boy, dwarfed by the presence of his father. But this was different. He did not cower. He looked at Sansa, who offered him a smile, then at Jon, who gave a curt nod of approval, and finally at Arya, whose eyes glimmered with pride. Bran was present, too, though he sat slightly apart, his gaze as distant as ever. Jon cleared his throat. "We gather tonight to remember those who gave their lives in the long night. Many brave souls fought, many died, and one man slew the Night King, securing our survival." His voice carried through the hall. "Theon Greyjoy." A wave of murmurs rippled through the assembled. Theon's heart pounded. It felt surreal to be recognized in such a manner, to stand where heroes stand. He forced himself to meet their eyes, one by one. Among them were lords of houses he had once wronged. There were knights and sellswords, wildlings and free folk, unsullied with impassive faces. All of them bore scars, some on the outside, some on the inside. And all were alive because the army of the dead had fallen. Sansa stepped forward. Her voice trembled with emotion. "Theon, you have protected us in our darkest hour. You fought bravely, and you suffered greatly. Winterfell owes you a debt that cannot be repaid. The North remembers." She reached for a sheathed dagger upon the table. The room was silent as she held it out to him. "This is Valyrian steel, reforged from a blade that once protected House Stark. It is yours now if you will accept it." Words tangled in Theon's throat. He wondered if he deserved such an honor. But then he remembered the words he had spoken to the old gods, the vow he had made in his heart. With a trembling hand, he reached out and accepted the dagger. The heft of it was perfect, the metal dark and etched with subtle ripples. He bowed his head, not trusting himself to speak without his voice cracking. Sansa placed a gentle hand on his uninjured shoulder. Jon then spoke. "Many have wondered how one man could slay the Night King. Some say it was divine intervention. Some say Theon's courage was unrivaled. I say it was redemption. But the how does not matter as much as the fact that it was done. And our children's children will know the name of the man who helped save us all." A roar of applause erupted, echoing in the rafters. Theon stood there, dazed, as lords and ladies stamped their feet, and soldiers clapped their hands in unison. It was a thunderous sound, reverberating with raw respect and gratitude. He felt tears prick at his eyes once more, but he refused to shrink away from the moment. He let it wash over him like a tide, letting go of the shame he had carried. Not that he would ever forget his sins, no, they were etched into his bones. But in this moment, the realm recognized him not as a traitor or broken captive, but as a champion of the living. That night, for the first time since the battle, Theon slept without nightmares. In his dreams, he saw the Iron Islands under a bright summer sun, the waves lapping gently, calling him home. He saw Winterfell's courtyard alive with laughter. He saw himself kneeling beneath the weirwood tree, hearing the whispers of the old gods in the rustling leaves. The past and future intertwined in that dream, no longer a torment but a tapestry of choices. When he woke to the pale dawn light, the pain in his side and arm was still there, but it was muted by a new sense of purpose. He was Theon Greyjoy, yes, but also something more, a product of both the Iron Islands and the North, a living testament to the power of redemption. The weeks that followed were filled with rebuilding. Theon contributed as much as his injuries would allow. He helped clear rubble, gathered the remains of broken walls, and even assisted in the forging yard, ensuring the final supply of dragonglass was accounted for. Though the threat of the dead had passed, caution ran high. Some insisted on forging more weapons in case any shadows lingered in the far corners of the realm. But overall, a tentative peace settled across the north. Messengers brought word that the rest of Westeros stirred, uncertain how to respond to the news. Theon felt detached from the politics. He had never cared for the intricacies of lords and alliances. He cared that Winterfell had survived. That was enough for him. One crisp morning, he found Arya in the courtyard, training with a group of young soldiers. Her feet danced across the packed snow as she dodged clumsy thrusts. When she spotted Theon, she nodded him over. He lifted his bandaged arm in a half-shrug. She smiled in that subtle way of hers, neither mocking nor fully kind, just acknowledging the bond they now shared. "If you're up for it," she said, stepping aside, "let's see how you fare with that new dagger." Theon hesitated, but a small grin curved his lips. "I might as well test it out." He was still stiff, pain a constant companion, but the thought of sparring with Arya awakened a glint of spirit within him. She tossed him a wooden practice sword with her typical no-nonsense grace. He swapped it out for the real dagger at his belt, deciding not to risk re-injuring himself with a heavier blade. Arya's eyes flicked over the Valyrian steel but said nothing. Her expression was resolute, focused. They circled each other as a few onlookers paused their own training to watch. Arya struck first, quick as a viper. Theon barely parried, his wounded arm protesting. She tested his defenses, feinting high then low, never giving him a moment's rest. He bit back curses, adjusting his stance to accommodate his injuries. Despite the pain, he found he could move with a fluidity that surprised him. Each time Arya lunged, he managed a step or twist that kept her from landing a clean blow. The truth was, she was faster than he could hope to be in his current condition. But the dagger in his grip felt sure, and he used her momentum against her whenever possible. They danced like that for a few moments, steel tapping against steel. Eventually, Arya spun behind him, aiming a decisive strike at his exposed flank. He pivoted, ignoring the flare of agony in his ribs, and used the pommel of the dagger to deflect her practiced sword. With an unexpected lunge, he pressed the point of his blade to her sternum. She froze, a bit of a grin ghosting her lips. Then, to his surprise, she let out a breathy laugh. "Well done," she said softly, stepping back. He lowered the dagger, breath ragged. Sweat beaded his brow despite the cold. Around them, a few soldiers offered subdued applause. Arya's praise felt genuine, and it warmed him. He sheathed the dagger, pressing a hand to his ribs where fresh pain hammered. She caught the wince. "You need time," she remarked, the concern hidden behind her usual bluntness. "Don't push too hard." Theon nodded. "Just testing the waters," he replied, but the truth was he relished the chance to feel alive, to move in ways that reminded him he was not forever broken. He gave Arya a grateful look, one she returned with a brief nod before turning back to her trainees. He left the courtyard with a faint smile lingering on his lips. The day came when Theon, though hardly fully recovered, felt the pull of the sea. Raven messages had come from the Iron Islands. Yara had retaken much of their homeland, scattered Euron's fleet, and secured her rule. She wanted her brother to visit, to see what they had reclaimed, and perhaps to stand by her side. Theon pondered the letter in his hand, reading Yara's words again and again. A year ago, he would have leapt at any chance to escape the north. Now, part of him felt conflicted. This had become his home in ways he never thought possible. He sought out Sansa in the crypts beneath Winterfell, where she was lighting candles for her ancestors. The musty smell of earth and stone enveloped them. Her red hair was tucked under a simple hood, her posture regal even in this somber place. She greeted him with a soft smile. When he explained Yara's summons, Sansa nodded thoughtfully. "You should go," she said, not without sadness. The Iron Islands are your home." He hesitated, searching her face. "But Winterfell is my home too." Her smile widened, a faint shimmer in her eyes. "Yes, and you will always be welcome here. You've done more for this family than I can ever repay." They stood in silence for a moment, the flickering candlelight dancing across their faces. In the shadows, statues of long-dead Starks bore silent witness. Theon let out a breath, his voice hushed with emotion. Thank you, Sansa. I think I need to see Yara to help her if I can. But I promise, I'll come back if you'll have me." She laid a hand on his cheek, an intimacy that took him by surprise. "We will always have you." A few days later, a small party assembled in the courtyard to see Theon off. His side was still tender, but he could ride with care. A half-dozen Northmen volunteered to escort him partway to White Harbor, where he would then take a ship to the Iron Islands. They loaded supplies onto horses, all the while exchanging farewells. Davos, with his steady gaze, gave Theon a firm handshake and a look that needed no words. Arya stood by the stables, arms crossed, a teasing smirk on her lips. "Don't forget how to use that fancy dagger," she quipped. "I'll expect you to be even better the next time we spar." Theon chuckled, nodding. "I'll practice every chance I get." He wondered if she believed him. He wondered if he believed it himself. Yet there was a quiet comfort in the way she teased him, as though he were truly part of the Stark circle. Bran's farewell was more enigmatic. He simply gazed at Theon, his words echoing in that serene, otherworldly tone. "You're where you need to be." Then he closed his eyes, as if the conversation required nothing more. Theon accepted that with a soft exhale. Of all the Starks, Bran seemed to exist in a realm beyond normal human concerns. And yet Theon could sense the gratitude in his presence, the acknowledgement that Theon's path had indeed intertwined with theirs at the crucial moment. Finally, Sansa approached, her bearing that of a lady of Winterfell. She handed him a small pouch. "A little gold for your journey, and some notes I wrote for Yara about trade possibilities with the North." She paused, her voice going quieter. "And, in case you ever doubt your place, I put a Stark pin in there. Wear it if you like." Theon's throat tightened as he accepted the pouch. He managed a nod, gratitude too large for words. Then, without hesitation, Sansa hugged him. He melted into the embrace, letting the warmth of her acceptance break down the last of his lingering uncertainties. He held her gently, mindful of his injuries, feeling her tears dampen his tunic. It lasted only a moment, but in that moment, the ghosts of all his past mistakes fell silent, replaced by the knowledge that he had, at last, found the family he had so long sought. He swung onto his horse, wincing at the pull in his ribs. With a final glance around the courtyard, at the battered walls that had been the battleground for humanity's survival, Theon smiled. He was no longer Theon the Reek, nor Theon the betrayer. He was Theon Greyjoy, the man who had stood between Winterfell and the Night King, and he had emerged with a soul reforged. Lifting a hand in farewell, he nudged his steed forward, the gates of Winterfell yawning open to reveal the snowy road beyond. As he rode away, the crisp morning air filled his lungs, each exhale a soft plume of steam. The sun was breaking over the eastern walls, sending rays of gold across the snow. He felt its warmth on his face, recalling how once he had trudged these roads as a prisoner to his own hubris. Now he traveled with purpose and dignity, the brand of shame replaced by a quiet sense of self. The wind whispered through the trees, as if bidding him farewell. Some might say he was off to the sea, but Theon knew better. He would carry the North in his heart wherever he went. When Winterfell's banners finally disappeared behind the rolling hills, Theon paused at a crest to look back, letting the horse breathe. The castle stood proud despite its scars, a testament to resilience, to the unity of the living in the face of oblivion. He closed his eyes and let memory wash over him. The taste of fear when the gate was about to collapse, the burning agony of the Night King's grip on his wrist, the triumphant crack when the dagger found its mark. He would never forget. A tear slipped down his cheek, cold against his skin, and he allowed himself that moment of sorrow and joy intertwined. Then he turned away and urged his horse forward. Life called to him in the form of his sister and his old homeland. The North had made him a hero. The Iron Islands might remind him of who he once was. Yet the difference now was that he carried within him a new identity, one forged in the crucible of the long night, shaped by loyalty, sacrifice, and a courage he had not known he possessed. Dawn stretched before him, a promise of new beginnings. And so, Theon Greyjoy, slayer of the Night King, rode on, ready to face whatever the tides of fate would bring, at peace with the man he had finally become. Theon Greyjoy's horse trod carefully along the snowy road that wound south from Winterfell. Days had passed since he rode away from the castle's towering walls, and each day he felt the ache in his ribs worsen or ease in capricious shifts, as though his body could not quite decide whether it would permit him to heal. A raw wind swept down from the mountains and whistled across the plains, sending shivers through the small escort of Northmen who traveled with him. They were a silent group, loyal to Winterfell, assigned by Jon Snow and Sansa Stark to see him safely partway to White Harbor. In their faces, Theon read a mixture of respect and caution. He was, after all, still Theon Greyjoy, son of Balon, once a betrayer of the North. But now he was also the man who had slain the Night King. The duality weighed upon him. Even as he tried to settle in the saddle, mindful of the healing scab where the Night King's frozen spear had cut across his side, he sensed the men's lingering watchfulness. What if Theon had a change of heart? What if he was still an ironborn raider, eager to pillage the North or vanish into the night with a stolen mount? Theon imagined these doubts flickering behind their guarded eyes. Yet he did not feel anger at them, only the barest pang of sadness, because once he had indeed turned traitor. He could hardly blame them for remembering. Travel remained slow, hampered by the drifts of snow that had settled after the long night storms. Now, though the sky had cleared, the sun poked through often enough that the crusted snow began to recede in places, revealing the brown skeleton of the land beneath. Theon found himself scanning the horizon, searching for the first sign of green, a sign of spring. He had grown used to bleakness, to the half-light that lingered over Winterfell. But the ultimate defeat of the Night King had brought a hint of promise. The snows, though thick, would not last forever. The world, battered and scarred, would renew itself in time. At each camp, Theon made it a point to help gather firewood, albeit gingerly, favoring his broken arm in its sling, and aid in settling the horses. He suspected it surprised the men, for they offered to do it for him. But he insisted, not in a flourish of false humility, but because it felt right. He had fought side by side with the people of the North, had bled for them, and would not place himself above the most mundane of tasks. At night, they would cluster around a small fire, exchanging murmured talk of how the world might look when they returned to their homes. Empty farms soon to be replanted, loved ones reunited after months of terror. Theon listened in silence, content to let them speak. He had no illusions about his own future. All he knew was that Yara waited in the Iron Islands, and that he, in turn, would return to Winterfell in time. The North was in his blood now, if not by birth, then by bond. When they reached the King's Road, slushy and rutted from the half-melted snow, they paused to decide the best route to White Harbor. The leader of his escort was a man named Halvard, a bearded fellow whose youth belied a certain fierce determination in his eyes. He had lost 2 brothers in the Battle of Winterfell but fought on, spurred by a sense of duty stronger than grief. Now Halvard conferred with Theon, unrolling a map with stiff fingers. The parchment fluttered in the wind, corners weighted by small stones. "The roads might be better here," he said, tapping at a path that veered slightly east. "Though there's talk of bandits. Men who fled the army of the dead and have turned to robbery. Better to face living bandits than the whites," Theon observed, voice dry. "We'll handle them if we must." Halvard nodded, eyeing Theon with something akin to reluctant admiration. He was still not entirely comfortable with Theon's presence, but the knowledge that Theon had driven a dragonglass blade into the Night King's chest made him a figure of awe nonetheless. They settled on the eastern route, hoping for fewer snowbound passes, and resumed their journey at a careful trot. The road narrowed in places, overshadowed by tall pines, and occasionally Theon would glimpse a scattering of deer or a fox bounding through the thinning snow. Life had been absent from this land when the dead marched south, but it was returning. One afternoon, they came upon a small hamlet, half abandoned. Its thatched roofs bowed under the weight of old snow. There was a single inn, with smoke rising from its crooked chimney. Theon's escort eyed the place warily. No sign proclaimed its name, and the wood-shuttered windows were closed despite the hour. They decided to enter anyway, eager for a hot meal and the chance to rest in a proper bed, however humble. Theon was the first to dismount, ignoring the protest of his battered ribs, and he led the way inside. The common room smelled of spilled ale and old stew. 4 or 5 figures huddled around a pair of small tables, speaking in low, tense voices. They looked up, startled, when Theon and the Northmen entered. One of them, a woman with a scar across her cheek, half rose from her seat, hand drifting to the hilt of a dagger. But Halvard lifted a gloved hand, showing he meant no trouble. The tension eased slightly. A squat innkeeper, bald with a stained apron, emerged from the back, wiping his hands on a rag. "Aye, travelers," he said. "Not many on the roads these days. You'll be wanting something hot." Theon glanced around, noticing how the locals' eyes flicked toward him, then away. Perhaps they recognized him, though it seemed unlikely in such a remote hamlet. More likely they were just wary of armed strangers. "Something hot would be welcome," Theon said, stepping aside so the others could enter. The innkeeper studied Theon's face, taking in the sling, the weathered lines of pain around his eyes, and said nothing more. He disappeared behind a battered wooden door, presumably to ready stew or bread, leaving Theon and the soldiers to find seats. They settled at a corner table. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. Theon was conscious of the hush that had fallen, and of the covert glances thrown his way. He lowered his gaze to the table, fighting a spike of discomfort. Once he might have swaggered in, demanding recognition, either as a Stark ward or, later, as a prince of the Iron Islands. Now he wanted nothing more than a simple meal, a moment's respite. Yet fame or infamy had ways of finding a man. He caught whispered fragments. "Heard the Night King's been slain. Some Greyjoy did it?" The words trailed off, replaced by suspicious stares. Halvard cleared his throat, leaning closer. "They've heard the rumors about you," he said quietly. "Might be best to keep your hood up." Theon offered a shrug. "I can't hide forever. Let them stare." Besides, a portion of him was proud that he had done something worthy for the North. Even if it invoked suspicion, it also meant that the truth, or at least something close to it, was out in the open. Perhaps he would always be a curiosity. Perhaps that was the price of redemption. The innkeeper returned with earthenware bowls of thin, oniony stew. It was hardly a feast, but after so many days on the road, the warmth and tang of salt on his tongue were welcome. Theon ate carefully. Each spoonful brought a dull ache in his ribs. His broken arm throbbed, stiff in its wrapping. Despite these discomforts, he found the stew tasted better than he would have expected. Maybe because every small comfort felt magnified after the terror of the long night. They paid the innkeeper with a few battered coins. Lodging was arranged for the night, and the group retired to a cluster of cramped rooms on the inn's second floor. Theon ended up in a tiny space with a straw pallet, the walls still damp from winter's chill. He sank onto the pallet, exhausted. Outside, the wind sighed through the eaves. Closing his eyes, he tried to ease his breathing, but inevitably, thoughts of the past intruded. The memory of the Night King's frozen gaze, the searing pain as Theon's sword had shattered against a White Walker's ice blade, the thunderous hush when the army of the dead collapsed at the moment of their leader's demise. He recalled the swirl of snow turning to shards of ice as the Night King splintered around his dagger. It was a memory that both haunted and comforted him, proof that even the darkest threat could be undone by one determined blow. At some point, Theon drifted into sleep, though he couldn't say how long he rested. A dream took hold. He was back in Winterfell's Godswood, knee-deep in fresh snow, the weirwood tree looming with eyes of red sap. Bran's voice whispered from somewhere unseen, urging him to rise, to stand, to protect. Theon tried to call out but found no words. The hush was absolute, broken only by the faint crackle of ice. Then, from behind the trunk, the Night King stepped forth, expression unreadable, lips curling in a silent challenge. Theon reached for his dragonglass dagger, but it was not in his grasp. Panic flooded him. As the Night King advanced, darkness closed in. He woke with a jolt, sweat slick on his forehead. His ribs screamed in protest as he jerked upright. Dawn's gray light leaked through a narrow gap in the shutter. Trying to steady his breath, Theon reminded himself that the Night King was gone, destroyed. Drawing the scratchy blanket around his shoulders, he sat until his trembling eased. Soon he heard a clamor of voices from the hall as the Northmen roused. Another day's ride lay ahead. They set out not long after daybreak, forging across fields half buried in melting snow, the horses' hooves sloshing through muddy ruts. Now and then, distant farmsteads came into view, some deserted, others with smoke rising from chimneys. In every face they passed, Theon saw the marks of exhaustion and cautious hope. They had lived so long under threat of an endless winter that the idea of spring's return must have felt almost impossible. Once or twice, as they paused to water the horses at a frozen stream, they were approached by curious locals. A stooped old man recognized the stark direwolf sigil on Halvard's cloak and asked if it was true. The threat from the north was finished? Halvard nodded, face solemn, telling the old man that yes, the Night King had been defeated. One of our own killed him, Halvard said, glancing at Theon in a moment of rare pride. The old man's eyes went round, and he stepped closer, as though to see whether Theon might be some legendary knight. But Theon said nothing. He merely offered a curt inclination of his head, then climbed back into the saddle. 3 days later, they descended a series of hills into a broad, muddy stretch of road that wound toward White Harbor. The distant parapets came into view, tall, proud walls of pale stone hugging the edges of the harbor. Even from here, Theon could smell a hint of brine on the breeze, a reminder that the sea was near. The gulls cried overhead, circling in slow arcs. The moment he heard their voices, a stir of emotion flickered inside him. He had grown up surrounded by the sea's harsh lullaby. Though the Iron Islands lay far to the west, the tang of salt air reminded him of Pike's stony crags and the pounding surf beneath them. For years, he had sought an identity in that brine, a sense of home. Now that same salt wind carried a different promise, perhaps of reconciliation, or at least a chance to stand side by side with his sister without the weight of old failures dragging him down. They arrived at White Harbor's gates in late afternoon. As the guards recognized the escort from Winterfell, the party was admitted without fanfare. Theon marveled at the bustle within the city's walls. Even in winter's grip, the harbor bustled with activity. Fishermen hauling in nets, dockworkers loading and unloading goods. The Manderley sigil flew above the fortress keep, a green merman with a trident on a field of sea green. Over the last months, White Harbor had become vital to the North's survival, a lifeline of supplies, and thus the city had not lain dormant even when the undead threatened. Now, with the Night King gone, it seemed to hum with new life. The men from Winterfell led Theon through winding streets, past fishmongers calling out to passers-by, blacksmiths hammering at their anvils, and children running in muddy lanes, shrieking with laughter. An onlooker here or there paused, perhaps recognizing the Greyjoy features or the sling around Theon's arm, but no one approached. It occurred to him that word had spread so widely about the Night King's fall that even here, his face might be known in rumor. Still, most were busy earning their keep, and no one parted the crowd as if he were a conquering hero. Theon was grateful for that small mercy. Their first destination was a modest inn by the docks, recommended by Halvard for its relative cleanliness and proximity to the ships. Theon dismounted, handing his reins to a stable boy who appeared wide-eyed to be in the presence of so many armed men. "We'll find lodging here," Halvard said to Theon. "But you'll be seeking a ship, I reckon." "Aye," Theon replied. "Yara is expecting me at Pike." Best to sail soon. Halvard inclined his head. We'll keep watch tonight and help see you aboard in the morning. I imagine you'll want some rest first. He left Theon to check on the men's quarters, and Theon walked along the docks alone, gingerly, letting the briny wind wash over him. Fishing sloops swayed at their moorings. Further out, a few larger vessels were anchored, white sails furled, hulls caked with patches of ice. He asked a passing longshoreman if there was a captain willing to sail for the Iron Islands soon. The man scratched his beard, squinted at Theon, and jerked his thumb toward a two-masted cog at the far end of the pier. Captain Torwin might. He's loading cargo for Orkmont. Close enough to Pike, if you don't mind a short row to get from one island to the next. Close enough. Theon thanked him and shuffled along the wooden planks, each step rattling his ribs. Overhead, gulls cawed, fighting for scraps tossed by the fishermen below. The harbor's water lapped at the pilings in a steady, soothing rhythm. Nothing like the savage storms that battered Pike, but enough to make Theon's heart twinge with longing. He had lived in the north for so long that sometimes he forgot the sea's pull. It was the same pull that had once driven him to claim Winterfell in a reckless quest to prove himself ironborn, that had ended in betrayal, captivity, torture, and years of regrets. Now the sea's voice whispered differently, gentler, or perhaps he was the one who had changed. He reached the cog, the largest vessel in sight, with a squat, barrel-chested man on deck overseeing the loading of crates. The man turned and eyed Theon with a mixture of wariness and curiosity. He had broad shoulders, a thick beard streaked with gray, and a battered tricorn hat perched on his head. Looking for passage? The man barked. Theon approached, raising his good hand in a sign of peace. I hear you're bound for Orkmont. I need to get to Pike. I'm Theon Greyjoy. The man's brow furrowed, and for a moment, confusion warred with recognition. Greyjoy, you say? You're the one from up north, aren't you? He narrowed his eyes, taking in Theon's ragged appearance. Didn't I hear some wild tale? The man who stuck a dagger in the Night King. Theon stifled a flinch. He could only guess how that rumor grew in the retelling. I'm no legend, Captain, he said, keeping his tone plain. Just a traveler looking for safe passage. I have coin. The captain's gaze lingered on Theon's sling, his face, perhaps weighing if it was wise or dangerous to ferry him. Then he nodded curtly. All right, I'll take you. We'll be setting sail tomorrow at dawn if the tides allow. Best have your coin ready. He jerked his thumb toward the gangplank, indicating Theon was allowed aboard to inspect the vessel if he wished. Name's Torwin. Theon introduced himself more formally, though Torwin's expression was still guarded. Still, it was enough. Theon tested the gangplank. It wobbled slightly and climbed aboard. The deck was cluttered with crates and barrels. Lines of rope coiled near the mast. The sails were furled neatly, rigging tight, and the ship smelled of fish and tar. He inhaled deeply, letting the tang of the sea fill his lungs. For a moment, he forgot the cold ache in his side, the heaviness of memory. Something in him relaxed, as if he had found a puzzle piece of his old self that fit without bringing the old shame. Thank you, Theon murmured to Captain Torwin, stepping aside to let a pair of sailors lug a heavy crate past. The captain grunted in acknowledgement, busy checking an inventory slate. Theon took one more look at the harbor. Seabirds wheeled overhead, and the water gleamed in the wan sunlight. Tomorrow he would depart for the Iron Islands. He could not begin to guess how Yara would receive him, nor what the islands themselves looked like after so long under Euron's malignant shadow. But the path was before him, and, for once, he felt no urge to turn away. That evening, Theon found himself in the dockside inn's common room, nursing a cup of watered ale. The Northmen who had accompanied him sat at a long table, feasting on stew and bread, retelling war stories. Twice they called him over, but Theon demurred with a small shake of his head. The press of bodies and swirl of conversation felt overwhelming. Instead, he lingered by the hearth, lost in his own quiet thoughts. Now and then, the inn door opened, letting in a gust of frigid air along with new patrons. Merchants, sailors, a pair of sellswords, a traveling bard who carried a battered lute. Eventually, a hush passed through the room as the bard found a seat near the fire. People expected a tune, some respite from the daily grind. Theon watched the man's fingers pluck a few experimental notes, uncertain and airy. He braced himself, wondering which ballad would follow. Perhaps some quaint love song or an homage to the king in the north. But the bard's eyes scanned the crowd, lingering briefly on Theon with an unreadable glint. Then he settled on the sellswords, who shrugged. The man began to play a melancholic melody, one Theon did not immediately recognize. The chords were soft, with a plaintive cadence that drifted over the crackle of the fire. A few words followed, describing a hero's final stand against an unearthly foe, a tale of heartbreak and deliverance in the long night. The room stilled as the bard's voice rose, singing of a man who had once lost himself but found redemption in the snows of Winterfell. Theon's cheeks grew hot. The lyrics were vague, not naming the hero outright, but every line cut to the bone. The hush around them deepened, as if the entire inn was leaning in to catch each word. Theon closed his eyes, letting the melody wash over him, unable to decide if he was grateful or mortified. So soon, the realm's singers were weaving new legends. A day would come when children might grow up hearing these verses, never knowing the twisted path that led Theon Greyjoy to that final thrust of the dagger. Theon felt each note like a lance to the heart, a raw mixture of pride and sorrow. When the song ended, the bard set his lute aside, ignoring the hush of onlookers who might have wished for a lighter tune. He nodded once, acknowledging the subdued applause, then turned to sip a mug of ale. Conversations resumed hesitantly, as though the mood had shifted. Theon exhaled, heart pounding. He could not remain in the common room any longer, so he rose and slipped out the inn's door into the cool night. The sea breeze slapped his face, a brine-scented reassurance. For a moment, he simply stood, letting the cold drive away the heat of his embarrassment. The sky was clear, a spray of stars overhead. Past the lines of boats, he saw the moon's reflection rippling on the dark water. He reminded himself that these tales, these songs, were not truly about him. They were about the Night King's defeat and the realm's survival. He had been an instrument of that victory. It was enough. He took a few steps along the pier, breathing carefully. The pain in his side was a dull throb now, his arm stiff in its sling. The memory of the dream in which the Night King returned gnawed at the edge of his mind. Logically, Theon knew the threat was ended. He had seen the creature shatter. But fear had a way of nesting in one's bones. The wind tugged at his cloak. He closed his eyes, hearing the faint echo of the bard's melody in his mind, reminding him that, for better or worse, he had become part of Westeros's lore. When dawn broke, Theon found himself standing at the foot of Captain Torwin's cog, bidding farewell to the Northmen. They clasped arms in a gesture of shared respect. Halvard gave Theon a solemn look. "We'll speak of you in the north, Theon Greyjoy," he said, voice hushed in the morning stillness. "You saved us. Don't let the Iron Islands forget that." Theon bowed his head, uncertain how to respond. For a moment, he glimpsed in Halvard's gaze the lingering shadow of old grudges, of how the Ironborn had once raided these coasts, how Theon himself had seized Winterfell. But also there was gratitude. Theon managed a soft, "Thank you," and then turned to step aboard, careful not to jostle his injuries. The sails were already unfurling, catching a crisp wind that carried the tang of brine. The deckhands were finishing last-minute lashing of cargo. Torwin stood at the helm, nodding brusquely as Theon joined them. So began the voyage westward, out of the harbor's relative calm and into the open sea. For the first time since his captivity, Theon felt the pitch and roll of a ship beneath him, the rush of salt air in his lungs. He found it dizzying and exhilarating all at once. The months spent at Winterfell, forging alliances and fighting the dead, had distanced him from the maritime rhythms he'd known since birth. But the sea did not forget a child of Pike. Even battered as he was, he felt the sway of the deck in his blood. It made him grimace with a pang of old memory. His father's scornful eyes, the rough voice of crewmen teaching him knots as a child. So many illusions had guided him then, illusions of conquest, illusions of bridging the distance between his loyalties. But illusions had shattered under Ramsay's cruelty. All that remained was the truth he now bore. He was both Greyjoy and friend to the Starks. He was Theon, shaped by salt and snow alike. The weather held clear for several days, though the cold lingered. Theon spent much of his time leaning against the rail, trying not to strain his wounded side. Once or twice, Captain Torwin attempted conversation. Mostly it was practical comments about the wind, the cargo, the potential for pirates. Theon listened, replying politely. He had never been a man of great seafaring knowledge. He had left Pike as a boy, after all. But the basics came back to him. The significance of the changing tides, the way the wind might shift at dusk, the reading of clouds. Occasionally, he helped coil rope or secure rigging with his good arm, ignoring the pointed stares of the sailors. They, too, recognized his name, though none seemed inclined to pick a fight with the rumored slayer of the Night King. At night, Theon would stand on the deck, gazing at the moonlit waves, lulled by the steady creak of timber. When he managed to sleep in his cramped berth, he dreamed less often of the Night King. Instead, Pike itself haunted his dreams. Tall towers rising from the sea stacks, rope bridges swaying in the wind, black waves crashing far below. He remembered the salt-soaked halls of his father's keep, the briny tang that pervaded every stone. Was that home? Or was Winterfell home? Both, perhaps, or neither. But soon enough, he would have to face the question for real. Weather turned foul after a week at sea, forcing the cog to tack southward in search of calmer waters. Rain lashed the deck, and Theon retreated below, feeling each wave slam the hull. He had no stomach for storms after all he had endured, but the rocking only aggravated the ache in his side. He braced himself against the bulkhead, trying to breathe evenly, while the rest of the crew struggled to keep the vessel on course. Lightning shattered the sky, revealing the roiling expanse of dark water outside. For hours, the storm howled, and Theon closed his eyes, focusing on the memory of the warm hearth in Winterfell's great hall, of Sansa's steady presence, of Arya's swift grace. It anchored him, reminding him that he had faced worse horrors than the fury of the sea. By dawn, the tempest subsided. Torwin steered them back northward, around the cape that would eventually lead them toward the Iron Islands. Theon emerged onto the deck, blinking at the gray, rain-washed sky. The sails dripped, and the crew looked haggard, but they had weathered it. Still, Theon's heart pounded at the thought of how close they might have come to foundering. He had seen enough death. Yet the gods, old and new, or the drowned god, had spared them. Perhaps they wanted Theon to face his sister at last. On the 10th day, the crier perched in the crow's nest shouted, "Land ho!" Theon peered through the haze, glimpsing jagged silhouettes rising from the sea. The Iron Islands. Sheets of rain still misted the horizon, but the shape of Orkmont's coastline grew sharper as the hours passed. The captain wanted to land there first, to discharge cargo, and then Theon would seek a smaller boat to ferry him directly to Pike. Leaning on the rail, Theon watched those dark cliffs loom closer, battered by waves. The memory of them felt lodged in the marrow of his bones. The Iron Islands were not welcoming, never had been, but they were fundamental to who he was or who he used to be. They anchored at a small harbor on Orkmont, overshadowed by high, rocky bluffs. Smoke curled from huts along the shore, and the stench of rotting fish permeated the air. Crewmen scrambled to lower rowboats and ferry goods to land. Theon followed them in the second rowboat, biting back a wince every time the swell lifted and dropped them. He was relieved to feel the rough pebbles of the shore underfoot, even if his boots sank into the damp, gritty sand. The cove held a few battered ships, not the impressive longships of old, but smaller vessels with patched sails. Theon glanced around, uncertain who he might speak to about passage to Pike. He need not have worried. A tall, lean woman with cropped hair approached, wearing a leather jerkin and an air of authority. She assessed Theon with a slow once-over, gaze lingering on the sling. "Came in with Torwin's crew, did you?" she asked, voice curt. Where are you bound? He told her he needed to get to Pike. I'm Theon Greyjoy, he said, quietly but clearly. Yara is my sister. The woman raised an eyebrow. Theon Greyjoy, is it? She crossed her arms, a faint smirk curling her lips. We've heard talk you killed the Night King, or so the crows say. My name's Phalia Stonehand. I serve Lady Yara, overseeing Orkmont in her stead. If you're truly Theon, I'll take you to Pike. A rush of relief mingled with wariness. I am truly Theon, he insisted, though he wouldn't be shocked if they demanded proof. Perhaps the name alone, and that battered, haunted face, was proof enough. I have no reason to lie. Phalia's gaze flickered with something like respect. Lady Yara said you might come. She didn't say when, but she said if you do, treat you as kin. We'll sail as soon as the tide turns. It's a short trip, but if the seas are rough, we might not make Pike's Harbor before dusk. Theon exhaled. Yara had expected him, then. That knowledge soothed some of the tension coiled in his chest. Very well, he said. Thank you. Phalia signaled to a few of her men, then turned on her heel. Theon followed her along a narrow track that wound through the cove settlement. He saw ironborn, men and women with sea-weathered faces, carrying nets or crates of fish. Many stared openly at him, though none spoke. A few times he heard hushed comments. That's Balon's boy, isn't it? Thought he was dead. He's the one who turned Stark, they say. Killed the Night King? Bah, tall tales. Theon kept his head high, ignoring the murmurs. At a small dock half hidden by a rocky outcrop, Phalia's crew readied a stout, single-masted boat with a carved kraken figurehead. Theon recalled that symbol so well, the emblem of House Greyjoy. Yet seeing it now made his heart twist. The battered prow reminded him of the old reavers that had once sailed under Balon, launching raids on the north. Times had changed, or so Theon hoped. He did not want to be that man, thirsting for blood and conquest. He stepped aboard gingerly, feeling the wet planks beneath his boots, trying not to aggravate his healing side. Phalia barked orders, and soon they were pulling away from Orkmont's shore, the rhythmic dip of oars echoing across the water. The crossing to Pike felt longer than Theon remembered, perhaps because he was restless with anticipation. The boat pitched on rolling waves, gray-green under a cloudy sky. Sharp spires of rock dotted the seascape, some thrusting high above the surface, crowned with ancient watchtowers or the remains of them. Gulls screeched overhead, spiraling in wide arcs. The air tasted strongly of salt, reminding Theon of his childhood when he'd believed these islands were the whole of the world. Late in the afternoon, Pike came into view, rising like a fortress of jagged stone from the ocean. Towers perched atop narrow stacks of rock, joined by worn bridges that swayed in the gusting wind. The keep's main structure clung to the largest outcrop, defying the crashing waves below. Countless storms had battered these walls, but they stood firm, black and unyielding. Theon swallowed hard. He had not returned to Pike since the disastrous days leading up to his invasion of Winterfell. Now, the sight of it was both daunting and strangely comforting. This was the seat of House Greyjoy, the place where he had taken his first steps. It had shaped his earliest memories, then cast him out to be a ward of Ned Stark. So much history in these stones, history he had once yearned to reclaim. Phalia guided the boat past jagged reefs, maneuvering carefully to a small harbor that jutted from the rocky cliff face. They moored at a narrow dock, where half a dozen ironborn stood watch. At the sight of Phalia, they waved her in. Theon climbed out, limbs stiff. The wind whipped at his cloak, making him stagger. The dock was slick with spray, and he had to clench his teeth against a new spike of pain in his ribs. One of the ironborn men eyed him with obvious skepticism. Theon braced himself, meeting the man's stare. Then, wordlessly, he followed Phalia up a steep, winding set of stone stairs carved into the cliff, heading toward the keep. Up they went, climbing stone steps that were slick with algae and seawater. Now and then, waves crashed far below, sending up great plumes of foam. Theon felt the reverberation through the rock, like the beat of some slumbering giant's heart. By the time they reached the top, his muscles ached, and he was breathing hard. But he refused to show weakness. This was Pike. He would not cower before the very place that birthed him. The outer courtyard of the keep was small, its walls built from age-blackened stone. The iron portcullis was raised, manned by guards sporting the Kraken sigil. Thalia led Theon under a high archway into an inner yard. More men and women paused, startled to see them. Theon's presence rippled through the space like a sudden shift in wind. Some recognized him on sight. Others only heard his name whispered by those who did. Theon squared his shoulders, ignoring the twinge in his side. Then, from the stone steps beyond the yard, a familiar figure emerged, tall, broad-shouldered, with short-cropped dark hair and a bold face. Yara Greyjoy. She wore a leather cuirass decorated with the Kraken emblem, a sword belted at her waist. Her steps were determined as she approached. Theon's heart stuttered, and he removed his hood, letting her see him fully, sling and all. They stopped a few paces apart. The courtyard seemed to hold its breath, everyone waiting to see how the Lady of the Iron Islands would greet her long-lost brother. Yara's gaze swept over Theon. His worn clothes, the lines of pain in his face, the battered splint on his arm. For a moment, he caught the glimmer of emotion in her eyes. Then she stepped forward and pulled him into a fierce embrace. Theon's ribs flared in protest, but he didn't care. He closed his eyes, hugging her back with his good arm, feeling the tension in her frame. "You bloody fool," Yara murmured, voice low. He wasn't sure if that was an insult or an endearment, but it made him laugh. A shaky, relieved laugh that threatened to become a sob. Yara pulled back, holding him at arm's length, her gaze piercing. "I heard 1,000 tales, Theon. That you were maimed, that you fought against the Night King, that you died, that you slew him with your own hand. Figured half of it was fisherman's nonsense." He swallowed. "I'm alive, and I'm here." She nodded slowly, her eyes roving over him as if trying to reconcile memories of her little brother with the man he'd become. The courtyard watchers began to disperse, sensing that their lady wanted privacy. Yara beckoned for Theon to follow her inside. He limped after her, past the heavy oaken doors into the keep's main hall. Salt-scented torches crackled along the walls, illuminating a space that felt both familiar and strange to Theon. The layout was much the same, though the tapestries, battered chairs, and war trophies had been rearranged or replaced. He remembered those days, so long ago, when he'd returned under Balan's summons, seeking to forge an alliance that led only to pain. Now silence enveloped them. Yara dismissed the guards, and they retreated, leaving brother and sister alone in the flickering corridor. She turned to face him, fists on her hips. "I sent out word for you after I took back the islands from Euron. I didn't know if you were dead or lost. Then ravens came saying the dead were marching on Winterfell, that you were in the thick of it. Now you walk in looking like you've survived 7 hells." Theon let out a shuddering breath. "I have, in a way, but I heard you reclaimed Pike, that you've solidified your rule. I'm proud of you, Yara." She smirked, a faint trace of warmth behind it. "We had help. Euron's men were scattered after his defeat in the south. Good riddance. Now, there's still pockets of loyalists to that mad bastard here and there, but the Iron Islands are mine, ours, I suppose." Her voice wavered the tiniest bit on that word. "So come on then. Let's get you some rest and a meal that's not salted fish." He blinked. "I thank you." She set off down the corridor, and Theon followed, marveling at how it felt to be welcomed rather than scorned. They ended up in a smaller hall once used for council. A large table stood at its center, scarred from countless knives. Yara slid into a chair, gesturing for Theon to do the same. He gingerly lowered himself, trying not to jar his ribs. Servants came at her summons, pouring ale and bringing a plate of bread, smoked fish, and a thin stew. Theon could taste the salt in everything, but it was less watery than what he'd had on the ship. Yara watched him eat in silence, arms folded, a mixture of relief and curiosity playing across her face. Finally, she said, So it's true, then. Theon Greyjoy, the man who killed the Night King. Theon swallowed, feeling the weight of that statement. Yes, I had help, or at least I was standing on the bones of thousands who fought before me. But, yes, I stabbed him with dragonglass. He shattered. Yara leaned forward, eyebrows raised. Gods be damned. That's something. You always were a stubborn one. He let out a soft laugh at that. Stubborn and foolish, you said once. But I had a chance to do something right this time, and I took it. Not just right, Theon, unbelievable, she said. A moment passed, and her gaze darkened. I heard you suffered in the north, that you were broken. I'm sorry I wasn't there to. He shook his head, cutting her off. There was nothing you could have done. Ramsay Bolton had me. A flicker of old terror danced behind his eyes. But it's done now. I've left that behind. I've tried to make amends. I never can, not fully, but when I was at Winterfell, I realized something. I have a place there, too. The Starks. He paused, searching for words that might not sound foolish to an iron-born mind. They're family as much as you are. Yara pursed her lips, nodding slowly. I won't pretend to understand it, but if they gave you a chance, and you found your courage again, that's all I need to know. She took a sip of ale, eyes narrowing. Will you stay? The islands could use you. You're the rightful heir after me. You might not relish the thought, but we're short-handed. Euron's rampage scattered half our fleet, and some of our people are wary of me, though they have no love for Euron. They might be more inclined to unite if the Greyjoy siblings stood together. Theon breathed in, thinking of how he had once longed to stand at the head of a Greyjoy fleet, to be a prince of the Iron Islands. But now it felt distant, like it belonged to a boy he no longer was. I'll help in any way I can, Yara, he said, voice quiet. But I can't promise I'll stay forever. I told the Starks I'd return one day. They accepted me again. I owe them. I owe you. She studied him a moment, then nodded. Fair enough. Let's not worry about forever just yet. You look like a man who needs time to heal. She glanced at the bandage and sling. How bad is it? Not as bad as it could be, Theon said, rubbing a thumb over the splint. It'll mend, the maester said, but the pain's fierce. It gets worse with the cold or damp. In Pike, you'll have plenty of both, Yara said wryly. We'll set you up in proper chambers. I had the old tower cleaned out after Father died, but it's still a bit drafty. We can see to your injuries, get you a real maester's care. Then I'll show you what we've done these last months. We'll talk of the future, see if you want to help me rebuild the Iron Fleet. We may not be at war, but we need to be strong. Theon nodded, an unexpected flicker of pride stirring within him. The Iron Fleet. In his youth, it had been a symbol of freedom and terror alike. Now, if it could be turned to something that served not just reaving but honest prosperity, it would be a small redemption for House Greyjoy. Yes, he said quietly. I'd like that. If I can help set a new course for our house, I will. She let a small smile break across her lips. Then she stood, beckoning him to follow. Come, I'll show you your room. As they walked the corridors, Theon was struck by how memory clashed with reality. That old tapestry was gone, replaced by a salt-stained map. The corners smelled of brine and mildew. The wind rattled shutters every few steps. And yet, there was a sense of cautious renewal in the keep. Ironborn soldiers patrolled, exchanging respectful nods with Yara. Servants carried fresh rushes, scrubbing the floors. The gloom of Pike was carved by a slender ray of possibility, a sense that this ancient fortress might do more than brood over the waves. Yara led him across a narrow bridge to the tower that had once been set aside for visiting lords, a precarious crossing that made Theon's stomach churn when a strong gust hit. Halfway across, he paused to look out at the surging ocean below, the waves smashing against the barnacle-encrusted stone. His broken arm throbbed, but he gripped the guide rope with his good hand, reminding himself not to look down. Yara smirked at his caution, but she slowed her pace, perhaps remembering how he'd been away from such heights for a long time. They arrived at a sturdy door. Yara pushed it open, revealing a dim chamber with a small fireplace, a bed, and a chest for belongings. The bed was covered with furs, the walls hung with fishing nets and the occasional driftwood carving. An ironborn aesthetic for sure. A single narrow window overlooked the sea, letting in the sound of waves. Theon stepped in, letting out a breath. It was not grand by southern standards, but it was a far sight better than the dungeons he'd once known. "I'll leave you to it," Yara said, leaning in the doorway. For a moment her face softened. "It's good to have you here, Theon. Truly." He offered a grateful smile. "It's good to be here." She left, pulling the door shut behind her. Theon stood for a long moment, gazing around the room, feeling the unsteady sway that came from hours at sea. Then he gingerly set aside his cloak, easing the sling from his neck to test his injured arm. Pain flared bright, forcing him to gasp. He sank onto the bed, one hand pressed to his side. A wave of memory washed over him. The Night King's face, the swirl of snow, the agony in his wrist as the creature crushed it. As always, it took effort to banish those recollections. Slowly, the pain subsided to a manageable throb. He let himself lie back, staring at the rafters, hearing the ocean's steady roar through the window. Images flickered through his mind. The battered walls of Winterfell, Sansa's kindly smile, Arya's lethal grace, Bran's distant gaze, the shrill cry of a dragon overhead. All of it belonged to another place, another time. Yet he was still that same man, shaped by both betrayal and redemption. Perhaps that was why the ache in his side felt so persistent. It was a reminder that to be truly whole again, he would need to merge those parts of himself, Ironborn and Northern, on his own terms. He closed his eyes, letting the lull of waves draw him into restless sleep. He woke some time later to a knock on the door, light but insistent. A boy in tattered clothes brought a small iron pot of hot water, presumably for washing. Thanking him, Theon struggled upright. The gloom outside suggested late evening, the sky a dark slate. His body felt stiff, but the brunt of the pain had eased after lying down. He splashed water on his face, feeling the salt residue cling to his skin. Then he changed into a fresh tunic left by the servants, plain gray wool that smelled faintly of the sea. Despite the ache of healing wounds, he felt better. There was a gentle sense of returning to some fundamental corner of his life, even if it was overshadowed by old ghosts. Shortly after, he ventured from the tower, crossing the same rickety bridge to reach the Great Hall. He found a modest gathering of Yara's captains there, gruff, battle-worn men and women, some missing eyes or limbs, each bearing the manner of one who had survived countless storms. The table in the center was spread with shellfish and seaweed bread, jugs of ale and flagons of wine. Yara beckoned him over. Theon took a seat beside her, conscious of the many stares. "I've told them you're here to help rebuild," Yara said, loud enough for the others to hear. "You've all heard the stories. My brother is the one who ended the long night. And yes, he's Ironborn. We'd do well to remember that." A ripple of murmured approval, or at least grudging acceptance, passed along the table. Theon bowed his head slightly. One captain with a braided beard spoke up. "We lost good men fighting for Euron's madness. Some still resist, thinking Yara's too soft on the mainland. You're with us now, though, so maybe they'll see reason. Or they'll challenge me," Yara said, leaning forward. "And we'll handle them. Ironborn do not lack for bravery, but we need to channel it better than reaving each other. We've begun constructing new longships, forging alliances with the mainland for trade. The old ways of simply raiding might keep some small families going, but it won't strengthen us in the long run." Theon listened, remembering how Balon Greyjoy had led relentless raids, championing the old way of paying the iron price for goods. Clearly, Yara had a different vision, perhaps a more measured approach, one that recognized the changing political climate. If the dead themselves had marched on Westeros and were thwarted only by unity, how could the Ironborn remain perpetually at odds with the rest of the realm? As they spoke, Theon picked at the food, shrimp and salted cod, biscuits hardened by sea air. He tasted the brine, a flavor he hadn't savored in a long time, Conversation ebbed and flowed around him. A few of Yara's captains asked questions about the battle in the north. Theon answered with sparse details, not seeking to aggrandize himself. He spoke of the howling storm of whites, the roars of dragons overhead, the final confrontation at Winterfell's gates. They listened, rapt. Some were skeptical. Others looked unsettled. They had not witnessed the horrors beyond the wall or at Winterfell, and it seemed beyond imagining that the dead had truly walked. Yet here was living proof, a man bearing scars from that night. After the meal, the captains dispersed, some retiring to a side chamber to discuss routes for trade vessels, others departing for their quarters in the keep. Yara lingered with Theon, the hall now quieter, firelight dancing across the walls. She rubbed her temples, sighing. "Leadership is heavier than I thought it'd be," she confessed. "Euron's fiasco set us back, but the Ironborn still look to House Greyjoy. If we can unify them, really unify them, we might build something lasting." Theon studied her. In the flickering torchlight, he saw the toll of responsibility etched in her face. Gone was the carefree swagger she'd shown when he first reunited with her years ago. She was still fierce, but her ferocity was tempered by the weight of ruling. He realized he admired her deeply for that. "You're on the right path," he said. "Raiding alone won't sustain us, especially after everything that's happened. The world changed when the Night King came. We can't pretend it didn't." She nodded. "I'm glad you see it that way." Then she gave him a sidelong look, hesitant. "Theon, I'll ask you again. Will you stay? If not forever, at least for a while, help me solidify this. The people respect you now, or at least they're in awe of what you did. If you speak for a new direction, we can gather them behind us." Part of him wished to say yes immediately, to repay her faith. But the memory of Winterfell pulled at him, that sense of belonging he had found among the Starks. Still, there was no reason he couldn't stay for a time. Help Yara reorganize the Iron Islands, heal the last pockets of dissent. Then he could make his return journey to Winterfell with a lighter conscience. He gave Yara a faint smile. "I'll stay for now. Let's see what we can do." Yara exhaled, as if a tension in her shoulders released. "Good. Tomorrow let me show you the fleet. It's not as large as Father's old armada, but it's ours." She reached out and clasped Theon's good hand firmly. "We'll do this together." He felt the calluses of her palm, a reminder that she had fought for every scrap of power she held. He said quietly, returning the clasp. "Together." Over the following weeks, Theon settled into a rhythm on Pike. He woke each morning to the crash of waves below his tower window, stepped onto the precarious bridge, and ventured into the keep's main corridors. A local maester inspected his wounds, changing the bandages around his ribs, applying a pungent salve that stung but aided healing. Theon's broken arm slowly regained movement. The sling became less necessary, though he still wore it at times. Day by day, the throbbing eased, replaced by a dull ache that flared if he overexerted himself. He accompanied Yara to audiences with local lords. Lord Saltcliffe, Blacktide, and other island families who had once sworn fealty to House Greyjoy, then vacillated under Euron's reign of terror. Some were resentful that a Greyjoy had sided with the mainland in the war, though ironically, Theon's slaying of the Night King made them both impressed and suspicious. The Ironborn prized martial skill after all. Few feats were more impressive than killing a foe of legend. "Perhaps you used some northern sorcery," Lord Saltcliffe muttered darkly at one meeting. He was a broad man with a pockmarked face, wearing a battered seal-fur cloak. "Those Stark wargs are rumored to dabble in such things." Theon felt a pang of anger, but Yara spoke up before he could retort. "Sorcery or not, he did it. And if he hadn't, we'd be overrun by undead. The Iron Islands can't stand alone against the wide world." Saltcliffe scowled, gaze flicking to Theon. "I never said we needed to be cowering behind southern skirts. But maybe we can still carve out the old ways, raids, plunder. Keep what's ours by the iron price." "There's nothing to raid, you old fool," Yara snapped, exasperation lacing her voice. "The entire realm is battered. They're rebuilding. If we want to trade for goods, For timber, for alliances, we need them stable. If we go back to old reavings, we'll only set ourselves up for the next war, which we can't afford. We're not strong enough to fight everyone at once. Saltcliffe barked a short laugh. So we bow and scrape to the mainland? No, Theon interjected, voice firm. But we can't repeat the mistakes that nearly destroyed us. We need ships to fish, to trade, to secure our coasts. We can't just throw away what's left of our men on raids that yield nothing. The older lord glared, but Theon held his gaze, refusing to shrink back. Attention crackled in the air, the weight of tradition versus the reality of the changed world. At length, Saltcliffe grunted. If the Greyjoy siblings stand together, maybe there's something to that. But don't expect me to kneel to King's Landing or Winterfell. We're iron-born. Nor do I, Yara said. We're forging our own destiny. Just not with blind raiding. And so it went. Some houses were more receptive, seeing the value in forging safer trade routes. Others grumbled, clinging to old vendettas and glories. Theon recognized that a unity forced by Euron's cruelty was not real unity at all. It would unravel as soon as fear waned. Yara's approach, though bold, required persuading each holdfast that cooperation was a better path than isolation. On good days, they made progress. On bad days, they encountered stiff-necked men too proud to move forward. Still, Theon persevered. He was no charismatic lord, but his name carried weight, and he had discovered a new reservoir of confidence, one earned on the battlements of Winterfell, facing death incarnate. Petty squabbles seemed less daunting by comparison. When negotiations ended each day, Theon often walked the keep's battlements with Yara or one of the captains, observing the state of Pike's fortifications. Repairs were underway, masonry crews shoring up crumbling walls, carpenters fixing rotted wooden parapets. He could see the potential for a strong seat of power, not just for war, but for governance. The crash of the sea provided a constant backdrop, a reminder that the Iron Islands were never truly still. On other days, Yara took Theon down to the shipyards at Lordsport. There, the skeletons of new vessels rose from the stony beach. Hammering rang out as shipwrights shaped planks from driftwood and imported timber, mainly from the Neck and from alliances with the Riverlands. Theon found it surreal, walking among these half-finished hulls, inhaling the pungent scent of pitch and sawdust, hearing the ring of hammers and the snap of sails. He offered suggestions where he could, though he mostly listened to the shipwrights' expertise. They needed more supplies, more men trained in the craft. Once, the Iron Islands had produced fearsome longships at a rate unmatched by any other region. But war had torn that tradition apart. Rebuilding would take time. Yet for all these daily tasks, for the sense of slow but steady progress, Theon felt a growing tug at his heart. Winterfell loomed in his mind whenever he stilled. He thought of Sansa's quiet dignity and Arya's unwavering loyalty. He pictured Bran's distant stare, Davos's weary smile, and Jon's acceptance. They were rebuilding too, perhaps already well on their way to forging a new north. He wanted to be certain they were safe, that they thrived. At night, he lay in his Pike Tower room, haunted by half-formed dreams, seeing himself perched between two worlds. He was ironborn by blood, but also a Stark at heart. How long could he linger here before those loyalties grew restless? As the weeks turned into a month, Theon's injuries improved significantly. The maester removed the tight bandages around his ribs, leaving only a simple wrap for occasional support. He tested his strength daily with mild exercises, careful not to tear healing tissue. Bit by bit, he regained the use of his arm, though he suspected the bone would ache in cold weather for the rest of his life. One windy afternoon, he ventured into a courtyard with a wooden practice sword, ignoring the drizzle of salt-laden rain. A few curious onlookers watched as he gingerly swung the blade, reacquainting himself with the motion. The pain was tolerable if sharp at times. Slowly, he moved through forms he'd learned years ago in Winterfell, forms taught by Roderick Castle, refined by hours of sparring with Robb. The memories brought a pang of nostalgia, but also a sense of purpose. His practice was interrupted by Yara striding into the courtyard, wearing a half-smile. Trying to be a swordsman now? she teased. I recall you preferring a bow. He rested the wooden sword against his shoulder, wincing slightly. My aim's not steady enough yet for archery. Figured I'd see if I can still swing a sword without embarrassing myself. Yara snorted. You killed the Night King. I think we'll forgive you if your form is off. He grimaced. That's not something I can rely on in a real fight. A white doesn't dodge or feint like a living opponent. And the Night King, that was more luck and desperation than skill. She studied him, arms folded. Well, I have some time. Show me what you can do. She picked up another wooden sword from the rack. Despite wearing a leather jerkin and breeches, she looked every inch a warrior, confident in her footing. Theon felt a twist of nerves but also a flicker of excitement. He had sparred with Yara only a handful of times in his youth, always overshadowed by her older, more practiced skill. Now he was older, battered, yet reborn in a sense. They circled each other. Theon kept his grip loose, mindful of his side. Yara attacked first, swift and controlled. Theon parried, the jolt running through his healing bones. He gritted his teeth, stepping back to deflect another blow. She was strong, direct, and he had to move carefully to avoid aggravating his injuries. Yet his time at Winterfell had taught him resilience, a certain cunning in the face of stronger opponents. He feinted low, then aimed for her shoulder, forcing her to twist aside. They exchanged a flurry of strikes, the wooden swords clacking through the courtyard. Rain dripped from their hair and clothes, but neither yielded. At last, Theon slipped on the wet stone, and Yara seized the opening, pressing the tip of her practiced sword to his chest. He froze, breathing hard, chest heaving. She held his gaze, then lowered the sword and offered a crooked grin. Not bad, little brother. You're slower than me, but you've got heart. And you didn't faint from pain, which is a plus. He managed to smile, though his side throbbed. A few more weeks, and I'll be better. You'll never surpass me, she teased, ruffling his damp hair. Then her tone softened. But you're certainly not the cowering wretch Euron belittled. You're strong again, Theon. He lowered his gaze. I have to be, for what's ahead. She nodded, tossing the wooden sword aside. Come on, let's get out of this drizzle. If you soak any further, your ribs might seize up. They returned the practice swords, and Theon couldn't help but feel a spark of camaraderie. Sibling to sibling, forging a new bond. Inside the keep, they dripped onto the flagstones, ignoring curious glances. Yara pressed a hand to his shoulder. I've got a meeting with the shipwrights. Want to come? Her tone was casual, but he could sense the underlying gesture of trust. She valued his input. He nodded. Sure, let me just dry off a bit. So they continued their routine, day in and day out, slowly cementing Yara's authority and Theon's place at her side. He learned which captains might cause trouble, who among the local lords needed reassurance. He joined Yara in the hall when the men of Great Wyke arrived with tidings of smugglers near their shores. He watched as Yara deftly brokered a solution, allowing the smugglers to legitimize their trade in exchange for a cut of the profits. Ironborn cunning, put to use in a way that avoided unnecessary bloodshed. Theon found himself impressed by how Yara balanced the old Ironborn ways with the necessity of modernization. In the quiet hours, Theon wrote letters to Winterfell. He struggled with the words, uncertain if the ravens would fly so far or if the castle's maester might even read them. Still, he tried. He addressed them to Sansa, to let her know he was alive and well, that he was aiding Yara in restoring peace to the islands. He wondered if Sansa would write back, or if the wind-snatched notes would vanish into the sea. Nonetheless, it felt right to send them, bridging the distance with each carefully penned line. After nearly 2 months on Pike, Theon decided it was time to speak with Yara about returning north. His ribs no longer pained him constantly. He could hold his own in practice sparring. He had done what he could to support Yara's efforts, meeting lords, encouraging the building of new longships, and lending credibility to her rule. Much work remained, but Yara had proven adept at handling it, and many on the islands acknowledged her as their rightful ruler. Theon's presence had opened doors, but now he yearned to fulfill his promise to the Starks. He found Yara in the Solar, a cramped room above the Great Hall, warmed by a brazier. She was poring over a chart of shipping lanes with one of her captains. When Theon cleared his throat, she glanced up, saw the intent in his eyes, and dismissed the captain with a gesture. The woman bowed and left, leaving them alone with the crackle of the brazier. Outside, gulls cried in the wind, swooping around the tower. Theon stepped closer, resting his hand on the back of a chair. Yara, my injuries are nearly healed, and she held up a hand, anticipating his words. You want to return to Winterfell? He nodded, exhaling slowly. I promised them I would come back, and I want to see how they fare. Maybe there's more I can do to help them rebuild, too. Yara studied him, her expression tinged with regret. I knew this day would come. I've seen how you look when the ravens come in, half hoping for a letter. You belong there as much as here, it seems. He swallowed. I'm still Ironborn, but the Starks, they're my family too. They forgave me, Yara. Took me in, gave me a chance to atone. I can't walk away from that. He paused, guilt fluttering inside him. But that doesn't mean I'm abandoning you. I can come back if you need me. She was silent for a moment, then laid a hand on his uninjured shoulder. Theon, if not for you, I might not be sitting here. You helped me secure the islands, earned respect with your story of the long night. I'm grateful, but I can see this is in your heart. Go back to the north. The islands will manage. A faint, lopsided smile curved her lips. I have to show the men I can rule without leaning on my legendary brother all the time. He returned the smile, relief blooming in his chest. Then let me do one last thing before I go. Take a look at the ships, talk to the lords. Make sure everyone knows we stand together. She nodded. Of course, we can even arrange a small feast in your honor. Let them see you depart with your head high. Her voice dipped. I'm proud of you, you know. We used to laugh and fight as children, never imagining we'd live through all this. But you faced horrors, overcame them, and became someone stronger than I could have believed. His throat constricted. I'm proud of you too, Yara. More than you know. They stood there, sibling to sibling, each carrying scars of their own, each forging a new path for House Greyjoy. Then Yara cleared her throat, returning her gaze to the chart. Let's finish up this lane plan, then I'll meet you on the battlements. We can set a date for your departure. Agreed, Theon said. He stepped back, letting his sister return to her tasks, while the sense of resolution rippled through him. He would return to Winterfell soon. His heart pounded with anticipation at the thought of seeing Sansa, Arya, and the others again. He wondered how the castle fared now that spring was peeking around the edges of the cold. Perhaps they had begun planting, rejuvenating the land that had been ravaged by the army of the dead. Perhaps they had new alliances, new troubles. Whatever awaited, Theon would stand with them, a living link between the North and the Iron Islands. Over the next several days, Yara and Theon made the rounds. They inspected ships, greeted returning captains, and met with lords once more so Theon could bid them farewell. The reaction was mixed. Some were sorry to see him leave, others silently relieved, suspecting that with Theon gone, they could revert to old habits. But Yara made it clear that she would not tolerate regression. Theon's earned his place in Ironborn history, she declared at one gathering. And whether he's present or not, our course is set. We're stronger together, among ourselves and in alliance with the rest of Westeros. Finally, on a crisp, windy morning, Theon's ship was prepared at Lordsport. Yara had commissioned a stout longship to take him north to Seaguard, from where he could travel overland to Winterfell. She insisted on providing him an escort of a few loyal Ironborn to ensure safe passage, a kindness Theon did not refuse, though he doubted the roads would be as perilous now that the Night King was gone. Theon stood on the dock, gazing at the vessel's sleek lines, new timbers, a freshly painted kraken on the prow. Yara joined him, the wind whipping her short hair around her face. They exchanged a look of mutual respect. So, she said, off you go again. and I'm left to manage these soggy rocks." Her eyes flicked toward the imposing silhouette of Pike in the distance. He smirked. "You wouldn't trade it for the world." She scoffed, then enveloped him in one last embrace. "Write if you can. Let me know how the Starks are faring. And if you ever need a place to set anchor, you know where to find me." "I will," he promised, voice thick with emotion. He pulled back, giving her a final nod. Then, with the help of the crew, he climbed aboard. The anchor was lifted, sails unfurled, and the ship drifted away from the dock. Yara stood there watching until the distance swallowed her figure. Theon gripped the rail, heart pounding. The sea spread before him, waves catching the morning sun. He was leaving the Iron Islands again, but this time with a sense of closure he'd never had before. The battered child who once returned to Pike seeking his father's approval was gone, replaced by a man who had forged his own identity through trial, blood, and redemption. As the Iron Islands receded behind them, Theon allowed himself a moment of reflection. He had done his duty by Yara, helped lay the groundwork for a new chapter in House Greyjoy's story. And now he would return to Winterfell, to the Starks, his other family, and see how that new chapter might unfold. Perhaps he would walk the Godswood in the warm sun, greet old friends, share a quiet meal in the Great Hall. Perhaps he would find new ways to serve the realm. The future was unwritten, but for once, he felt no dread peering into its depths. The wind billowed the sails, carrying him northward. Theon stood tall on the deck, letting the ocean spray pepper his face, mindful of the steady pulse of his heart. He had survived hell and delivered the realm from the darkest threat it had ever known. He was Theon Greyjoy, once prisoner, once traitor, now slayer of the Night King and loyal friend to House Stark. And with each heartbeat, each breath of salt air, he embraced the possibility of living a life forged by honor, shaped by two homes, and free from the chains of the past. They reached the coast near Seaguard in just over a week, navigating calmer seas this time. Theon's escort parted ways at the harbor, wishing him safe travels inland. He stood on the docks, inhaling the brackish smell of the Great Delta. From here, it was many leagues by land to Winterfell, but he was no stranger to journeys. He found a caravan traveling north, a mix of merchants and a few soldiers from House Mallister, and paid them for safe passage in their company. Despite the battered roads, the trip felt almost leisurely compared to his frantic ride south from Winterfell months ago. Spring's gentle hand had touched the land, coaxing patches of green from the thawing soil. Theon watched buds forming on tree branches, birds returning to nest. It filled him with a quiet wonder, a reminder that life persisted after even the coldest winter. In the evenings, they made camp by the roadside. Theon helped gather firewood and stood watch when needed. The merchants welcomed him, especially when they recognized his name, though some were wary once they realized he was Ironborn. He kept mostly to himself, grateful for their practical company. A handful of battered knights heading to the Riverlands occasionally joined them, sharing stories of the war against the dead. They hailed Theon as a hero when they discovered his role, pressing him for details. He answered modestly, still uneasy with being called a hero. Each time, though, he felt a flicker of warmth. Perhaps if more people heard the story of the Night King's defeat, they might unite rather than fight among themselves. As they pressed deeper into the north, the nights grew cooler but not unbearably so. The snows along the roadsides had turned into patches of slush, revealing muddy ground. Villages still bore scars from the undead onslaught, burnt-out houses, gravestones freshly raised, but the spirit of the people seemed resilient. Doors displayed carved direwolf emblems in tribute to House Stark, a sign of gratitude or fealty. Farmers began tilling their fields anew, hopeful that the growing season would be enough to stave off hunger. Soon they came upon Moat Cailin, the ancient fortresses that guarded the neck. Though partially ruined, the causeway remained passable, and the crumbling towers were manned by northern soldiers. Theon approached with careful steps, bracing for suspicious glares. But upon learning his identity, the guards parted for him readily. "Any man who helped slay the Night King has free passage," said one, doffing his battered helm. Theon thanked him and continued on, the caravan rumbling behind. A few days more, and the wide expanses of the north opened up. Theon felt a surge of excitement he hadn't anticipated. Memories rose unbidden, old hunts with Robb, riding out with the men to check on local villages, bantering by the fireside. Those days were lost to time, yet the land itself felt as if it had been waiting. Each league brought him closer to Winterfell, to the seat of House Stark. He wondered how much had changed in these intervening months. Would the castle remain a place of refuge and camaraderie? Would Sansa still greet him with that gentle warmth? Would Arya's eyes still hold that lethal gleam of confidence? Would Bran remain as distant and all-seeing as ever? Finally, late one afternoon, Winterfell's towers came into view on the horizon. Theon's chest tightened at the sight. The walls looked sturdier than before. Repairs must have been completed. Banners fluttered in the breeze, the gray direwolf on white. Smoke drifted from chimneys, a sign of bustling life within. The caravan parted ways, heading east toward the last hearth. Theon pressed on alone, leading his horse up the familiar road to the gates. Guards stood alert, though they showed none of the desperation of the long night's approach. One recognized him instantly, eyes widening. "Gods, it's Lord Theon!" he exclaimed, turning to his comrade. "Open the gates, Lord Theon." He nearly flinched at the title, but it warmed him all the same. He guided his horse inside as the gates yawned open, stepping into the courtyard. The space was alive with activity. Smiths hammering in the corner, stable hands guiding horses, servants carrying sacks of grain. Theon dismounted, heart racing, looking around for a familiar face. For a moment, the swirl of activity continued without pause, and he felt oddly invisible in the midst of this daily hustle. Then a voice called his name. He turned to see Arya Stark striding across the yard, wearing practical leathers, her hair cropped short, wolf's head pommel shining on her belt. Her face lit with a grin as she neared. "You're back," she said, breathless, as if she'd run from across the castle. Theon bowed his head, humility mingling with delight. "Arya, I promised I would return." She stepped close, eyes flicking over him. "You look better, less battered than last time." Her gaze locked on his ribs, then his arm, as if checking for injuries. "All healed?" "Mostly," he said, feeling awkward but happy. "I have a few aches, but I can hold a sword." She nodded approvingly. "Good. Let's see how you fare against me tomorrow," she teased, though her eyes shone with genuine warmth. Theon felt a smile curve his lips. Arya of old might have been prickly, but these days she radiated a comfortable confidence. She grasped his forearm, a handshake of equals, and then stepped back. "Come on, Sansa will want to see you." With Arya leading, they wound through the courtyard. Onlookers began to notice him, and a low rumble of excitement spread. Some called out greetings, some whispered behind their hands. Theon felt his skin flush, though he nodded politely. Up the steps they went into the great hall, where a handful of people were gathered discussing provisions. Sansa Stark stood at the head of the table, conferring with Ser Davos Seaworth and a few northern lords. The moment Theon stepped inside, she glanced up, and her face brightened in a way that took his breath away. "Theon," Sansa said, quietly but unmistakably joyful. She excused herself from the conversation, crossing the hall with graceful strides. Theon bowed slightly, but she reached out and clasped his hands. "You came back." He raised his eyes to hers, heart hammering. "I told you I would." Her hands felt warm, steadying. For a moment, words failed him. He felt a rush of relief, gratitude, and something akin to belonging. Then he managed, "How is everything?" Her expression softened. "We're rebuilding. Each day feels a little more hopeful. Jon is traveling, representing the North with the Queen, so I've been managing the castle. Davos helps. Arya keeps the peace. Bran, well, he's Bran," she finished with a faint smile. Then her gaze flicked over his shoulder, noticing his partial escort, or the dust of travel. "You must be exhausted. Come, rest." There will be time for stories later. Thank you, he breathed, the words laced with a depth of emotion. He glimpsed Ser Davos approaching, the old knight's weathered face set in a kindly half-smile. Welcome back, lad, Davos said, patting Theon's arm. I see you've survived the sea once more. Good. Theon smiled. Yes, the seas were kinder this time. Good to hear, Davos said. We'll need a report of how the Iron Islands fare. But that can wait. Get some rest. You look about to topple. Theon indeed felt the fatigue of days on the road. But he was buoyed by the warmth he found in their voices. Sansa led him from the hall, weaving through corridors that had been repaired since the battle. Fresh stone, newly hung banners, corridors free of debris. She stopped at a simple but comfortable chamber. This one is yours, she said. We've cleaned it up since the fighting ended. He stepped inside, recalling that he had once roamed these halls in dread, uncertain of his place. Now it felt welcoming. A low fire crackled in the hearth. Thank you, Theon murmured. Sansa lingered by the door, her smile tinged with quiet joy. We've come a long way, haven't we? He nodded, voice hushed. Yes, and I'm grateful for it. She inclined her head, then left him to settle in, promising they would talk more at supper. Theon set his pack down, crossing to the small window. Outside, the castle yard hummed with the energy of rebirth. At the far corner, he spotted Arya practicing with some recruits. In the distance, smoke rose from the forges, the smithy forging new plows or weapons as needed. He saw no sign of dragons overhead, but the memory of them lingered, wings beating against the gloom of the long night. The wind carried the scent of pine and fresh-turned earth, replacing the rank odor of burned corpses. He closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the hearth soothe him. This was home as much as Pike had been. In truth, he realized, it felt more like home. Not because he rejected his Ironborn heritage, he had embraced it enough to help Yara, but because here the walls held a sense of acceptance he had craved for so long. Here he was not an outcast or a curiosity. He was Theon Greyjoy, who fought for the North, who slew the Night King. And also just Theon, a friend, a ward, a man who had found forgiveness in the unlikeliest of places. At supper that night, he sat at the high table with Sansa, Arya, Bran, and Ser Davos. The hall was lively, filled with bannermen and household folk, the scent of roasted meat and fresh bread swirling in the air. Sansa introduced Theon to a few southern envoys who had come north to discuss trade routes, describing him as our dear friend and champion, Theon Greyjoy. He felt a flush at her choice of words, but did not dispute it. Arya teased him about crossing swords the next morning, though there was genuine fondness in her tone. Bran sat quietly, but when Theon caught his eye, Bran offered a small nod, as if to say, "You are where you're meant to be." They spoke late into the evening, exchanging tidings. Theon recounted how Yara was rebuilding the Iron Fleet, forging treaties of peace. Sansa was glad to hear it. She spoke of the North's new alliances with the Vale and Riverlands, ensuring provisions for the next winter. Arya listened while sipping ale, occasionally interjecting with a wry remark or question about Ironborn traditions. Ser Davos, for his part, offered pointers on negotiating from the vantage of a man who had seen every corner of Westeros's politics. Finally, as the night grew dark, the conversation turned quieter. Servants cleared the tables, leaving a spread of fruit and cheese. Sansa folded her hands and asked, "And you, Theon? What will you do now that you're here? You spoke of returning, but have you decided how long you'll stay?" He looked around, seeing genuine warmth in all their faces. He considered how he might split his life between the Iron Islands and the North. Then he answered with quiet resolve, "I'll stay as long as I'm needed. Winterfell is my home, too, and I want to help. If danger comes or if Yara calls, I may sail again. But I want to stand by you all if you'll have me." Sansa's eyes shone, and she nodded. Arya smirked. "You might regret saying that when you see how many chores we have," she teased. Bran merely gave his faint smile, the shadows dancing over his features. Davos lifted his cup in a toast. "To Theon Greyjoy, then, May he forever stand between darkness and the realm of men. They drank, and Theon felt an upwelling of emotion that nearly overwhelmed him. Once, he had thought himself unworthy of any toast. Now he was part of something far larger, a vital stitch in the fabric of the living's triumph. He set his cup down, heart thudding with gratitude. This, he realized, was the closest he'd come to peace in a lifetime marked by restlessness and regret. It was not a perfect world. Westeros would doubtless face more trials, more wars or intrigues. But for this moment, the halls of Winterfell glowed with warmth and fellowship. The night ended, and Theon found his way back to his room, aided by the flicker of torchlight in the corridors. Settling onto his bed, he gazed at the ceiling, letting the hush of the castle wrap around him. Somewhere far above, the stars were bright, glimpsed through a window's narrow aperture. He thought of Yara on Pike, forging her own future. He thought of the old gods in the Godswood, the weirwood tree that had witnessed the horrors and joys of House Stark for generations. He thought of his father, Balon, and how differently things might have been if pride and vengeance had not stoked old grudges. Mostly, he thought of how he had once believed redemption was impossible, that he was doomed to be Reek, a coward, a traitor. Yet here he lay, a free man, welcomed by those he had wronged, having accomplished a deed that would echo in songs for centuries. He closed his eyes. Outside, the wind whispered, and in that gentle stirring of air, he heard not condemnation, but reassurance. He had chosen his path, bridging salt and snow, forging a name untainted by shame. Perhaps the world would never be fully at peace. Perhaps new threats would rise like storms across the sea. But Theon Greyjoy would stand ready. Son of Pike, brother to the Starks, slayer of the Night King, determined to protect the living in whatever battles lay ahead. And for the first time in years, he drifted into slumber with no nightmares waiting to devour him. Only the promise of a new dawn beyond the walls of Winterfell.